I was folding my dead wife's pillowcases when I noticed one of them smelled faintly of machine oil. Not enough for a mechanic's shop, not enough for anybody else to stop with a square of white cotton in his hands and feel the room tilt half a degree. Just enough to be wrong in a room Marjorie had kept smelling like starch lavender and sun even in February. I stood at the foot of our bed with the pillowcase stretched between my hands and had the strange immediate feeling that something in the house had already answered a question I had not yet thought to ask. The men were due at 8 to open the wall beside the old nursery closet. The house I have lived in for 39 years is a white two-story on a corner lot in Bexley, Ohio, with a broad front porch that gets too much wind in winter and maples that shed helicopter seeds into the gutters every spring. It is not grand, though it was once called substantial by people who believed brick and cedar shingles conferred character by themselves. What gives a house character if you live in it long enough is repetition. The same stair creak on the 5th step. The same lazy rattle in the dining room window when the buses go down Main. The same patch of afternoon light on the upstairs hall runner. The same person saying every year when the first hard frost comes, "Tom, you'll forget those geraniums till they turn to lace." Marjorie had been dead 11 months, 3 weeks, and 6 days that morning. Long enough that condolence had curdled into ordinary silence. Not long enough that I had learned how to walk through the bedroom without still measuring myself against the shape she had left behind. I stripped the bed every Wednesday because that had always been her day for it. I did not think about whether the sheets needed changing. That was not the point. The point was that if I changed them on Wednesday, if I folded the corners and shook the top sheet once to settle it straight, if I smoothed her pillow before I laid it back against the headboard, I could pass one more morning inside a structure I recognized. Grief at my age is less theatrical than people imagine. It is mostly clerical. You keep records with your body. The pillowcase still smelled wrong. I brought it to my face again and stood very still. The window above the radiator had fogged faintly in one corner from the change in weather. Outside, the bare branches over the side yard clicked together. Somewhere downstairs, the old kitchen clock gave its soft little throat-clearing tick before the minute changed. And through all of it, underneath it, a smell that did not belong in my bedroom sat inside the cotton like a held breath. Machine oil. I turned toward the wall beside the nursery closet and looked at the pale stretch of plaster the contractors were coming to open. The moisture damage had begun as a yellowing seam near the baseboard 3 months after Marjorie died. At first I ignored it because that is what widowers do with small signs of decay. We choose our losses. Then the paint bubbled in one narrow blister behind the cedar chest and the baseboard warped out by less than a 1/4 inch. Evan Kroll, the contractor my son-in-law recommended, said there was likely an old leak around the dormant plumbing that ran near the nursery side of the wall, and that if I wanted to stop patching and repainting, we ought to open it properly and see what had been feeding it. I said yes, because it was practical. I said yes because I had already learned that a house becomes punitive when you start pretending not to notice what it is telling you. I did not say yes, because some stubborn, shameful part of me had begun to resent the wall for needing anything from me at all. Marjorie had handled the house, not because I could not, but because she knew its moods better. She knew which windows swelled in August, which radiators hissed before snow, which closet door needed to be lifted 1/2 inch to close without complaint. After her death, I discovered that competence, when it dies in a house, leaves a draft. I laid the pillowcases in a neat stack and carried them out to the upstairs linen passage. Calling it a passage made it sound more romantic than it was. It was a narrow stretch between the bedroom suite and the old back staircase lined with built-in cabinets Marjorie had painted a muted cream 10 years ago because she said hospital white made clean things look anxious. She kept towels in one cupboard, winter blankets in another, sheets by size and room, all labeled in her square block handwriting on little cream tags she tied with blue string. Master, guest, Ellen old twin, nursery. The nursery set remained because she had never been able to throw out useful cotton and because grandchildren, in theory, might need them someday. That morning, opening the cupboard for the master sheets, I saw immediately that one stack sat lower than it should have. Again, not enough for anybody else. Not enough that a man with a sensible life ought to stand in a narrow hallway with a pillowcase over his arm and feel his pulse move up into his throat. But the lower shelf where Marjorie kept the older towel sets, good cotton thinned, but not frayed, reserved for house guests, and summer laundry overflow, had a clean blank strip along the back, where the dust pattern showed something rectangular had been stored there for a long time, and removed not recently but not years ago either. The outline was pale against the darker shelf. I stared at it, trying to remember. The memory did not come. What came instead was a picture of Marjorie standing in this same passage in her blue house sweater. 2 towels over one forearm, turning when she heard me on the stairs and saying, "Don't come up here yet. I've got pins all over creation." It was one of those tiny domestic recollections that should not hurt as much as they do. I could see the look on her face exactly. Not irritation, never that, but brisk territoriality. The face she wore when a room was between states, and she wanted it finished before being seen. I had kissed the side of her neck anyway that day, and she had said, "Thomas Mercer, you are a nuisance in old age, which in our marriage was not criticism but weather." Standing there now, staring at the missing space on the towel shelf, I realized I could not remember what she had been doing in the passage that afternoon, only that she had not wanted me in it yet. The doorbell rang at exactly 8. Evan Kroll was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with a face permanently arranged into practical sympathy. Men who spend long enough going into other people's houses acquire that expression, or they do not stay in the work. Behind him was his younger helper Luis, carrying a drop-cloth bundle and a long zippered case of tools. Cold air came in around them, smelling of wet leaves and diesel. "Morning, Mr. Mercer." "Morning. You still all right with us, opening her up today?" Her up. He meant the wall, but in a house like mine, pronouns never stay where you put them. I stepped aside and let them in. The men laid masonite down through the front hall and up the stairs. The house changed temperament at once. Any home does, when strangers start bringing intention through it. Marjorie used to say repair work was like illness. Even necessary disturbance unsettles the furniture. I followed them up with my hand on the banister, embarrassed by how exposed the upstairs felt with boot steps and tool weight moving toward the bedroom. The metronome sat where it had sat for years on the narrow console table in the hall outside the nursery. Walnut wood pyramidal, older than our children once used when Ellen took piano lessons and then kept because Marjorie disliked throwing out anything that still knew its job. I had dusted around it the previous Saturday and thought nothing of it then. Now, for no reason I could name, I paused beside it. Its brass pendulum caught the grey morning light. One side of the wood had faded more than the other from years near the window. When I set my finger lightly against the base to move it an inch farther from the drop-cloth path, I felt something soft under one corner. Not wobble. Cushion. I lifted it and saw a small square of dark felt glued neatly underneath. "Mr. Mercer," Evan called from the bedroom doorway. I set the metronome down where it had been. "Coming." The men worked fast and quietly. They moved the cedar chest out from the wall, then the small upholstered chair from the corner by the closet. Luis taped plastic over the dresser and windows, while Evan scored the plaster seam with a utility knife. Dust already had that dry mineral smell that always makes me think of school basements and old church renovations. The machine oil scent from the pillowcase seemed stronger now, as though opening the room had loosened it. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have. At some point, a homeowner becomes an extra body in his own room. Evan glanced back and said kindly, "We're good here a few minutes if you want coffee." "No, I'm fine." He nodded in the way men do when they know you are not fine but prefer to let you keep possession of the word. The first cuts were ordinary. The reciprocating saw bit into plaster and lath with a deep shuddering growl. Dust lifted in pale sheets. Luis held the vacuum hose close behind the blade. When Evan pried the first narrow section free, nothing showed but dark cavity old studs and insulation sagged with age. He handed the piece back without comment and cut lower. Then the sound changed. It was not louder. It was duller. Instead of the blunt chatter of saw through ordinary interior wall, there came one brief, muffled scrape as though the blade had met something softer than wood and yet more deliberate than cloth. Evan stopped immediately. "What is it?" I said. He did not answer at first. He set the saw down, crouched, and reached his gloved fingers into the opening. When he pulled them back, there was grey dust on the leather, and one narrow thread of off-white felt caught against the knuckle. He looked at it, then at the wall, then back at me. "Luis," he said quietly, "kill the vac a second." The room went still. You do not think in a moment like that in large thoughts. You think foolishly. I thought of mice. I thought of some old insulation wrap. I thought of nothing that justified the look on Evan Kroll's face as he rose from his crouch and took off one glove. "What is it?" I asked again. He opened the wall another 6 inches with a pry bar instead of the saw. The plaster came away in a larger section. Behind the first row of studs was not only a cavity space, but a narrow second-plane, hand-finished wood fitted between 2 supports where no such thing had any business being. The wood had been sanded smooth. Along one side, at a height just below my knee, ran a shallow ledge no more than 4 inches deep. My mouth went dry. Evan leaned in with his flashlight. The beam moved slowly across the interior and caught on pale rectangles fixed against the dark backing. Pencil marks, short horizontal dashes climbing one stud grouped irregularly, then the beam slid lower and stopped. "There's a cup in here," Luis said. I came closer before I could stop myself. Near the back sat a small enamel cup, white once, now chipped blue along the rim. Beside it, rolled tightly and tucked into the corner, was what looked like an old child's blanket, or the remains of one flannel worn thin and fixed against the wood with small upholstery tacks. The lower edges of the studs were wrapped in narrow strips of padding. Felt or blanket something soft enough to keep sound from carrying if it rubbed. I heard my own voice say, "What is that?" Evan straightened slowly. "Mr. Mercer," he said, and then stopped as if the sentence he had in mind had to be taken apart and rebuilt before it could be used. "Say it." He looked once toward the open bedroom door, then back at the wall. "Sir, your wife didn't just patch this wall." His voice was low enough that it changed the room around it. She made a place behind it for somebody small to stay quiet. I stared at him. "No," I said, though there was no argument in it yet. Only refusal. "No. That doesn't—" He held up one hand, not to silence me, but to slow the moment. "I'm not saying I know exactly what for. I'm saying this wasn't framed for storage, and it sure as hell wasn't framed by a plumber. See this here?" He pointed with the flashlight. "Edges are hand-sanded, padding on the contact points. That ledge could hold a plate, a book, whatever. And those marks, I stepped past him before I understood I had moved. Dust brushed my trousers. The opening was jagged, but the space inside was unmistakably intentional. Not large enough for comfort, not large enough for anything that did not force my whole mind away from it in recoil, but large enough for a child to crouch, or curl, or wait. On one side of the hidden paneling, just above the ledge, someone had pasted a small square card, no bigger than an index card. The paper had yellowed at the edges. On it, in simple blue lines, was a drawing of a bed. I reached toward it. "Careful," Evan said. My hand stopped inches short. A memory rose so sharply that for a second the room doubled. Marjorie standing in the parlor 5 years ago while Martin Vale stirred sugar into his tea. The front window had been open an inch for spring air. Ellen, visiting with her little girl, had come halfway up the stairs after using the downstairs bathroom, and Marjorie had looked up and said too quickly, "No, honey, stay down here with Grandpa. A minute." I had thought nothing of it, because there was always something to think nothing of. A tray not cleared, a hem not finished, a room not ready. Now, with a card bearing a child's bed pasted inside a hidden wall in our bedroom, That old tone came back to me with a small, cold exactness. I took one step back. My wife would have told me, I said, and the instant I said it, I knew how thin it sounded. Evan did not answer. That was merciful of him. He and Luis stood aside while I looked. The room had become offensively familiar in its details. The eyelet curtains Marjorie chose because she said anything heavier made a bedroom feel secretive, the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, the oil portrait of my grandmother, no one liked enough to argue over. But Marjorie claimed on principle because family ought to look at family. All of it still itself. And beside it, inside the wall, a narrow hidden shelter fitted with softness and signals. There are shocks that make a man feel as if his life has shattered, and there are shocks that do something quieter and often worse. They remove one load-bearing assumption at a time while leaving the visible structure standing. I did not feel ruin. I felt displacement, as if somebody had opened the back of a clock and shown me an extra gear that had been turning for years without my knowledge. "How long you think it's been there?" I asked. Evan crouched again. "Hard to say exactly till we open more." "Not recent. Wood's old. Dust layering says it hasn't been touched in a while, but this was built with intention." He shone the light up toward the top of the space. "Mr. Mercer, there's more back here than I can see from this angle." I swallowed. "Open it." He looked at me closely. "You sure?" "No," I thought. Then, because I could not bear to hear myself say it, "Yes." The next 20 minutes passed in a kind of white compression. More plaster came down. More of the secondary paneling emerged. The hidden space extended farther toward the nursery closet than I had imagined possible, which made no sense because I knew the dimensions of this room and of that closet, or believed I did. Behind the finished inner wall, narrow cleats had been added to support the ledge. The padding wrapped only certain surfaces, precisely those a shoulder or knee or hand might strike in the dark. On the floor of the cavity, the old boards had been covered with a layer of something softer, flat wool, maybe, or rug, felt cut to fit. Luis handed me the enamel cup. It was lighter than I expected and cold with dust. The chipped blue rim was worn smooth where a mouth had used it many times. In the bottom sat a little grit and one curled thread. I set it carefully on the dresser. On the upper stud, where the pencil dashes climbed, I could now see they were not random. Some were grouped in pairs, some in threes, with a little extra space between sets. Measurement or count. On the opposite side, another small card had been fixed to the wood. This one showed a hand under running water. "Those for a kid?" Luis murmured mostly to himself. No one answered. At 9:15, my daughter called. I looked at the phone in my hand and saw her name Ellen beside the photograph I never bothered changing, taken 6 summers ago when she was standing with one hip cocked and a paper plate in her hand at our 4th of July cookout. I stepped out into the hall to answer because I could not bear the sound of an ordinary conversation in that room. "Morning, Dad." The furnace company called me back about Ellen. Something in my voice made her stop. "What happened?" "There's something in the bedroom wall." A pause. Then carefully, "Something alive." "No." I looked at the metronome on the console table. "No, not now." She was at the house 31 minutes later. My daughter has her mother's mouth when she is bracing for bad news, and mine when she has already decided not to be dramatic about it. She came in wearing a charcoal coat and soft-soled boots, kissed my cheek without greeting, and went straight upstairs with the kind of contained speed that means a person is spending all her energy on not running. I met her at the bedroom door. "What is it?" I stepped aside. She did not gasp. Ellen was not a gasping woman. She stopped with one hand still on the jamb and took the space in the way a triage nurse might fast hole, unwilling to look away from any part of it once committed. Her eyes moved from the opened wall to the ledge to the cup on the dresser to the small picture card to me. "Oh," she said, and the smallness of it unnerved me more than any outburst would have. "You've seen something like this?" I asked. "No. Then what is that look?" She took a few steps into the room. It's not a look. She stopped, glanced toward Evan and Luis, and lowered her voice. Dad. Mom did this. That seems to be the suggestion. Don't say it like it's a bookkeeping error. What would you prefer I call it? She looked at me then, and the answer that rose between us was too large for the room. I saw her refuse it. Instead, she said, "Can I look in the closet?" The nursery closet had not been used as a nursery closet for decades. It held old wrapping paper, a plastic bin of board books kept for grandchildren who visited twice a year at most, a portable crib mattress, one standing fan, and 3 garment bags containing dresses Marjorie could not bring herself to give away because they had once belonged to her mother. Ellen opened the door and stood inside for a long moment without touching anything. "It's shallower," she said. "What?" She turned. "This closet. It's shallower than it should be. I've had this house 40 years, and I grew up in it. It's wrong." She put her palm flat against the back wall. Or maybe it always was, but Mom compensated for it somehow. Her voice shifted. Was there something behind this too? Not yet. Evan came to the doorway. "There's definitely continuation through here, ma'am. The cavity runs toward that closet side. Different framing than I'd expect." Ellen nodded without taking her hand off the wall. Then, almost absently, she tapped twice with her fingertips against the painted plaster. The sound was faint, hollow, in a way the rest of the wall was not. All at once, I remembered Marjorie doing exactly that somewhere in the house. Tap, tap, a pause, then a movement. Not words. Rhythm. The memory slid away before I could fix it. Ellen stepped back. "When did you say the leak started? After your mother died?" She gave me a look I could not read. "Of course it did." "What is that supposed to mean?" "Nothing. Just..." She glanced toward the workers again. "Can we talk downstairs?" "No. We can talk here." Her jaw tightened. "Dad. I have spent my life disliking scenes, which is not the same as avoiding truth, but can resemble it too easily. There was something in Ellen's posture then that told me if I backed her into saying the wrong thing in front of 2 contractors, I would regret it later. So I let her lead me into the upstairs hall and closed the bedroom door behind us. The hall runner, an old faded Persian Marjorie insisted made the passage less severe, muffled our steps. Light from the nursery window fell across the metronome on the console table. Ellen noticed it at the same time I did. "Why is that out here?" she asked. "It's always been out here." "No, it hasn't." I turned to look at her fully. "Yes, it has. Maybe the last few years." She frowned, staring at it. "I remember it in the nursery, on the shelf by the books. It used to be there. So why is it here, I don't know. Your mother moved things, not without reasons." There it was again. Not accusation exactly, more dangerous than that. Competence carrying implication. I said, "What are you trying to tell me?" She looked past me toward the bedroom door. "I'm trying not to say anything stupid before I understand what we're looking at." "Then start with what you do understand." Her face softened then in a way that startled me, as though for a moment I looked not like her father, but like someone she pitied. "I understand Mom got tense on certain days and acted like she wanted people downstairs where she could see them. I understand she used to take extra towels up before some church visits, which I always thought was odd, because nobody was bathing at a prayer meeting. And I understand she could look perfectly normal when she was frightened, which was one of the scariest things about her when she was scared." I said nothing. The house held itself very still around us. Down in the bedroom through the door came the muted bump of plaster being stacked and the low exchange of men working around a problem. "Ellen," I said finally, "if you are suggesting somebody brought a child into this house without my knowledge, I'm not suggesting anything yet." She rubbed one hand across her mouth, a gesture Marjorie used to make when she was forcing patience back into herself. I'm saying some things feel less random than they did an hour ago. Such as, she hesitated. Then she said, "Do you remember that spring Martin Vale used to come by so often after choir disbanded? Not for sermons, for grief groups, family council, all that. He came by even when Mom wasn't grieving anybody. Martin visited half the church. I know. He helped people. I know what he did publicly, Dad. There was no direct charge in it. That was what made it worse. Ellen, at 41, had learned the adult art of speaking near a thing so the person listening might step the remaining distance himself. I found that I could not. Martin has been in this house dozens of times, I said. Yes. If you have some memory, say it plainly. She turned away from me then and looked down the hall toward the back staircase, where the light always fell a little dimmer because the window at the landing was old wavy glass. When she spoke again, her voice had gone almost flat. I have a memory, she said, of coming upstairs for a sweater one afternoon when I was maybe 15, maybe 16. Martin was in the parlor. Mom heard me on the stairs and came out of nowhere. I mean nowhere. 1 second the hall was empty, and the next she was there. Ellen swallowed. She put both hands on my shoulders and said, "No, honey, stay downstairs with your father for a bit." I tried to summon the scene and could not. There were too many church afternoons, too many casseroles, too many visits that had seemed made of the same respectable furniture. That doesn't mean anything I said, though. Now even I could hear the weakness in it. "No," Ellen said. "Not by itself." What else? She was quiet so long, I thought she might refuse. Then she said, "She only did it one other way." What way? When she was really frightened. Ellen looked at me then, and her eyes had darkened into something I recognized too late from childhood illnesses and adolescent disasters. The look of a child who knows a parent cannot safely remain uninformed, even if the information itself may break something. Mom could be normal through anything, Dad. You know that. She could serve pie during a thunderstorm with the power half out and act like candlelight had been the plan. She could make a room behave because she behaved first. But when she was truly scared, really scared, she got very gentle and very fast at the same time. Like she needed people to move before they understood why. I stared at her. A draft moved through the hall, bringing with it the dry smell of plaster dust and old cotton from the linen passage. My heart had begun to thud in a way I disliked because it made me feel my age more than exertion ever did. What are you saying? I'm saying that day in the hall when she sent me back downstairs, she had that voice. Ellen's own voice lowered. And I haven't thought about it in years because there wasn't a reason to. But seeing that wall in there. She stopped. The silence between us seemed to travel backward through the house, touching rooms in sequence. Bedroom, nursery, linen passage, parlor, a line of spaces I had believed I understood. I looked toward the closed bedroom door, then back at my daughter. When did this happen? I told you. That spring Martin was here a lot. No, I mean this. I gestured helplessly toward the room beyond the door, the wall, the hidden ledge, the cup. When did your mother... I don't know. Ellen's face tightened. That's the point, isn't it? I don't know what she was doing. I only know there were days she wanted me downstairs where you were, and days she carried fresh towels upstairs before he came. And once after he left, I came back up for that sweater, and she was in the linen passage crying without making any sound. I felt the floor shift under me, though it had not moved at all. She told you that no. I saw her, and you never said anything. She gave a small and believing exhale. To who you thought Martin walked on water. Mom pulled herself together in 30 seconds and told me she'd gotten dust in her eyes. Then she folded 2 bath towels like it was the most important thing in the world. Ellen's mouth trembled once and then steadied. I was 16. In this family, if nobody named a thing, it became rude to see it. That landed harder than anything yet, because it was not entirely fair. and because it was close enough to fair that defending myself would have been pathetic. From behind the bedroom door came Evan's knock. Mr. Mercer. I opened it. He stood there holding a small stack of stiff cards in one gloved hand, white-yellowed edges curling. Each bore a simple blue drawing, a bed, a cup, a hand, a window. These were tucked back along the far panel, he said. Thought maybe you'd want to see before they get disturbed anymore. I took them. The paper was brittle with age. On the back of the card with the bed was one word in Marjorie's handwriting. Safe. My daughter looked over my shoulder and made a sound I had never heard from her before. Small and voluntary, like something inside her had just recognized a language it did not want to know. We stood there in the doorway of my bedroom, the hidden space open behind Evan like a second mouth in the wall, while the cards shook slightly in my hand. Then Ellen said very quietly, "Dad." I turned. Her face had gone pale in a way that made her look both older and suddenly very young. She looked at the cards, then toward the front of the house, as if some old hallway had just reopened in memory. When Mom sent me downstairs like that, she said the only time she ever used that voice. She stopped once, swallowed, and forced herself through it. Were when Martin Vale was in the house. For a second I thought I had misheard her. Not because the words were unclear, Ellen had never been unclear in her life, but because the sentence would not enter my understanding in one piece. It struck and separated like hail on old glass. Martin Vale. In the house. As if those four ordinary words had not belonged together for years without consequence. As if they had not passed my threshold in polished shoes carrying casseroles after funerals, Bibles after illnesses, his hat in his hands, and concern arranged gently on his face. I looked at my daughter and saw that she wished she had said anything else. The cards trembled once in my grip and then went still. Behind us, Evan shifted his weight. Even Luis seemed to understand that whatever work had been happening in the wall had stopped being construction. It had become something uglier and more private than strangers should have to stand beside. Dad, Ellen said softly, "You don't have to decide anything right this second." The humiliation of that almost made me angry, not because she meant harm by it, but because I heard underneath her care the suggestion that I might be too old, too shaken, too slow, or too invested in yesterday's decencies to manage what was standing in front of me. I did not want to be managed in my own hallway. "What exactly is it you think happened?" I asked. "I think Mom was afraid." "That is not an answer. It's the only honest one I have." The dust in the air gave the hall a pale, suspended look, as if the house itself were trying not to breathe. Downstairs, a truck passed and rattled the dining room pane in its frame. It sounded very far away. I became aware absurdly that I was still holding the cards as though they might bruise. "Evan," I said without taking my eyes off Ellen, "would you and Luis give us a few minutes?" "Sure thing." He closed the bedroom door behind him when he went back in. The noise of work did not resume. Ellen waited. I looked down at the cards again. Bed, cup, hand, window. Blue lines simple enough for a child. And on the back of one in Marjorie's tidy hand, that single word, safe. It was not her notepaper handwriting, not her holiday card handwriting. It was the block print hand she used for labels in the linen passage, for instructions on frozen casseroles, for the practical naming of household things. That was what made it worse. It gave the card no drama to hide behind. Marjorie had written that word as one writes sugar or guest or winter blanket, as a category of use. I heard myself say, "There could be reasons for this we don't understand." "There could," Ellen said. "She may have been helping somebody. A family problem, a custody issue, something temporary. Yes. She could have kept it from me because she knew I'd object to bringing trouble into the house." Ellen's mouth tightened. "Would you have—" I did not answer. That silence alone should have told me more than it did. Instead, I said, "Martin's name is coming into this much too fast. Her eyes sharpened at once. I didn't bring his name in out of nowhere. No, but one memory of your mother sounding urgent is not proof of what, Dad? There it was. That dangerous question in its simplest form. The demand not for evidence, but for courage of naming. I found I had none ready. The truth was that my mind had already moved ahead of me into rooms I did not want it entering, and some stubborn part of me was pulling it back by the collar. Not because I believed Ellen was inventing things. Not because the wall, the cards, the ledge, the cup, the softened studs could be wished back into harmlessness. But because the human heart, especially an aging one, does not surrender old structures of trust all at once. It bargains, it delays, it offers lesser explanations as ransom. I want to see everything I said finally, before anyone says more than they know. Ellen gave one short nod, the kind you give a doctor who has chosen the slower surgery. All right, she said. Then let's see everything. The next hour was spent in the open bedroom with the particular tension of people handling ordinary objects that no longer behaved ordinarily. Evan widened the breach in the wall, carefully moving from plaster to the thin finished wood inside. What emerged was not a room. I need to say that plainly because imagination is a reckless contractor of its own. It was no hidden chamber of the sort bad paperbacks use. It was a narrow service cavity, a dead space between the old nursery closet and the bedroom wall that some previous builder had left when plumbing lines were reworked decades earlier. Marjorie had not created its existence. She had discovered it and changed its purpose. The space ran low and tight, not even full shoulder depth in some places. At one end it widened enough for a child to sit with knees pulled up. At the other, closer to the closet side, it narrowed into darkness where some paneling had been fitted flush along the studs. There were air holes. I would not have noticed if Evan had not pointed them out, tiny drilled vents, hidden along the baseboard line behind where the cedar chest had sat. A layman, which I had been all morning, might have taken them for old worm tracks or damage. Seen together, they were ventilation. The blanket tacked to the wall was not a blanket, but 2 layers of old flannel stitched together with mattress batting between them. Marjorie had made it. I knew her whip stitch. She used it on quilt bindings and on the inside hems of winter curtains because she said machine stitching on certain old cloth looked impatient. Near the ledge lay a spoon wrapped in a child's handkerchief and another cup stacked inside the first. Behind them, in a corner, 2 more cards had been found, one with a simple drawing of a door, one with 3 circles in a row. 3 circles mean anything to you? Evan asked. No. But even as I said it, I was lying in the most literal sense. 3 circles meant nothing to my understanding, and yet something in me had already recoiled from them as familiar. Not the image itself. The structure of it. Repetition. Grouping. Meaning assigned through sequence. Ellen took the card and turned it over. Blank. There's more on the nursery side, Evan said. You want us opening from there too? I hesitated. To open the closet side would mean emptying it. The garment bags, the board books, the crib mattress, the fan, the storage of a family's postponed use. All those quiet, deferred things. An irrational possessiveness rose in me as though if I kept one side of the wall closed, I could insist the house was only partly altered. Do it, Ellen said before I spoke. She did not look at me when she said it. I should have resented that. Instead, I found myself grateful. By noon, the nursery closet had been emptied into the hall and Evan had marked the back panel for removal. The room itself, no longer a nursery, in any active sense, only the smallest upstairs bedroom kept tidy for grandchildren and occasional guests, had changed character simply by having its closet emptied. Spaces are like faces. Remove one feature and the whole expression shifts. The small brass bed made with a blue coverlet Marjorie used every spring looked suddenly too decorative. The low bookshelf, the framed alphabet print, the ceramic lamp nightlight plugged near the baseboard. Everything had the air of a room that had been staged around an omission. I stood in the doorway, while Ellen knelt by the pile from the closet, sorting with the efficiency of someone who needed her hands occupied. She stacked the books in one tower, flattened the garment bags, rolled the fan cord tight around its base. "Don't mix the tags," I said. She looked up sharply. "What?" "The labels on the sheet bundles. Don't mix them." There was a small silence. Then her face changed, not cruelly, not even with impatience, but with a kind of weary recognition. She heard in that one housekeeping instruction exactly what I was doing. The room behind us had opened onto a hidden child space, and I was still trying to save the order of cotton labels. "Okay," she said. The gentleness in it burned worse than criticism. I went downstairs and made coffee for all of us, because it was the one useful thing left to a man who had spent the morning being outstripped by his own house. The kitchen smelled of grounds plaster dust, carried on my shirt and the onion-sweet remains of the soup I had reheated for lunch the day before. At the sink, the weak November light came in grey over the side yard. The old maple back there still held 3 leaves against the trunk side where the wind had missed them. Marjorie always noticed those last leaves as if they were a kind of moral test. "Leave what is trying," she'd say. "Don't strip the poor thing bare out of tidiness." I stood with one hand on the kettle and saw her with painful suddenness on an afternoon 7 or 8 years ago rinsing teacups after Martin Vale had left. She had been quiet, which was not remarkable. But she had rinsed one cup 3 times after it was already clean. I remembered asking whether something was wrong, and her saying in that light, even tone women use when they are pushing an entire weather system back behind the eyes now. "Just tired of hearing careful men say careful things." At the time, I had laughed. I thought she meant theology. In the kitchen now, with the kettle warming under my hand, that memory changed shape so completely I had to set the mug down before I dropped it. Tired of hearing careful men say careful things. There are sentences in a marriage that lie dormant for years until one day they wake up with teeth. I carried the coffee upstairs on a tray and found the nursery closet open to the studs. The cavity connected exactly as Evan had predicted. Not neatly, not dramatically, more obscenely than that because the hidden system had made use of what the house had already offered. A false back had been fitted along the closet side set 3 inches forward from the true rear wall, and the removable panel matched the paint so precisely I doubt I would have found it if I had lived another 20 years. Along the inside face were shallow hooks holding a folded little cardigan, a cloth bag, and one square piece of paper laminated at the edges with old tape. The cardigan was pale yellow once now, almost cream, and at the cuff, one tiny bead had been sewn inside the hem. Ellen reached toward it and then stopped. "Should we?" I nodded, though the word felt wrong for a man granting permission over objects his wife had hidden from him. She lifted the sweater down and handed it to me. It was child-sized, yes, but older child, not toddler. 7 or 8, maybe. One sleeve had been mended under the arm. When I rubbed the cuff between my fingers, I felt the bead. "What's that for?" I said. No one answered. The laminated paper held another simple drawing, a staircase and a blue square. On the back in Marjorie's hand again were the words, "Not now." The shame of seeing her practical block letters inside a hidden wall in our nursery was almost physical. There had been no romance to any of this, no flourish. She had built a system. "I need to look through her papers," I said. "Ellen did not tell me I should have begun there hours ago. She only said, 'I'll help.'" The room that had become Marjorie's paper room after the children left home was the little office off the dining room, though she would have called it the desk room because office sounded to her like fluorescent lighting and phone cords. She paid bills there, balanced the church charity account there, wrote Christmas cards. There kept instruction manuals for appliances. No one else knew how to reprogram. After her death, I had cleaned only the visible surfaces, never the lower drawers. A widower becomes superstitious around unopened compartments. That afternoon I broke the superstition. The desk smelled faintly of lemon wax and old envelopes. The top drawer held exactly what it ought to have held. Stamps, spare reading glasses, extra address labels, a half-used legal pad, prayer list cards, a church directory from 3 years ago with penciled corrections in the margins. The second drawer held receipts clipped by month doctor copay records, appliance warranties, and 2 little composition notebooks she used as household logs. Furnace filter changed. Painter called back. Ellen's sinus meds picked up. Daniel's birthday dinner moved to Saturday. The third drawer stuck as it always had. I had never repaired it because Marjorie knew the trick of lifting one corner, and I had grown accustomed to letting her have superior knowledge over certain small mechanical matters. This time I worked it open carefully and found file folders labeled in the same practical hand. Church, school, taxes, house, miscellaneous. I sat in her desk chair and began with church, because the word itself now carried an insult I did not know how to answer. The folder was thick but orderly. Donation acknowledgements, volunteer schedules, women's committee minutes, typed meal trains, counseling referrals. For widows and sick parishioners, all the soft machinery of respectable care. Half an hour and my eyes were burning, and I had not found anything that justified the wall. Then Ellen, standing beside the filing cabinet, said quietly, "Dad." She held out one folded schedule. It was a volunteer calendar from late spring, 6 years earlier, printed from the church office computer names handwritten into blank slots for meal delivery, children's reading circle, and home pastoral support. Marjorie's initials appeared 3 times beside an entry labeled Home Council/Thursday. That in itself meant nothing. She did dozens of things like that. What meant something was the pattern. The 3 dates were spaced unevenly, as if assigned around a specific need rather than on rotation. And on 2 of them in the margin, Marjorie had made a tiny pencil mark that looked at first like a check, and then under closer view like 2 parallel taps. Tap, tap. The hallway sound I had been trying to remember all day seemed to move faintly through the back of my skull. I took the page from Ellen. She could have been keeping track. Yes, that's all. Yes. But the word yes had begun to mean something ugly between us. Not agreement. Endurance. We searched until the late afternoon light slanted low across the dining room table and turned every dust trace to silver. At some point I loosened my tie and never put it back on. At some point Evan came down to say they had secured the exposed wall openings for the night and could return in the morning. At some point Luis carried the debris bags out through the side door and avoided looking at me. The most damaging thing we found was folded into a hymnal. Marjorie kept 3 hymnals at home. One in the parlor bookcase for when Martin or others came by and wanted to share a text. One in the desk room because she used the blank back pages for grocery lists when no other paper was near. One on the small hall shelf outside the nursery because she once told me children ought to know books could live in more than one kind of room. I had laughed and said the nursery held no children. She had said, "Not consistently, no." I remembered that as soon as I opened the hall hymnal and a single photocopied sheet slipped into my lap. The page was from some school or therapy packet. The header read, "Basic Visual Supports for Home Routines." Below were black and white sample cards. Bed wash hands. Eat weight. Safe space, each with short notes about consistency, sequencing, and tactile reinforcement for children with hearing impairment under stress. One paragraph, half highlighted in yellow, mentioned rhythmic vibration through floors or furniture as a way to signal time or permission when verbal instruction could not be used. I sat on the upstairs hall runner with the paper in my hands and could not breathe properly for a moment. Ellen crouched across from me. "That's not church," she said. "No." The house was quiet in the way only a house with exposed walls can be quiet. Even silence has different species. This one had edges. I turned the page over. On the back in Marjorie's block print were 4 words. Ask Laura about cards. Laura, who Ellen asked. I looked up blankly. Then the name came to me from nowhere obvious. Laura Bell. Not from church. From the old public schools, speech and language. A woman with iron-gray hair and a voice like warm sandpaper who had once evaluated a neighbor boy with a stutter years ago when Ellen was little. Marjorie had liked her because she said that woman knew the difference between patience and delay. Laura Bell, I said. Is she alive? I don't know. Ellen took the paper from me and read the highlighted paragraph. Her mouth went tight. Dad? I stood up too fast and had to put a hand against the wall. The old plaster felt cool and faintly gritty under my palm. Not one wall in the upstairs hall, but several now seemed to hold more meaning than before, and I found myself looking at them not as surfaces, but as instruments. Which ones carried sound? Which ones carried taps? Which ones sat between the front rooms and the back? The metronome was on the console table where I had left it that morning. I picked it up and turned it over again. The felt square on one corner was not one square, but four, one under each foot cut carefully and fitted flush. The wood beneath them showed older glue marks, as if they had once been replaced. "Mom repaired this," Ellen whispered. I looked at her. She did. I remember because I asked once why she was fussing with an old metronome, and she said the feet were making marks on the shelf. My hand tightened around the object. It had been natural all these years to think of the thing as a leftover from piano lessons. Furniture of time, decorative almost, a harmless relic of scales and childhood impatience. Now, with the photocopy in my hand and the felt under its feet, it changed under my grip from sentiment into use. I set it on the hall floorboards, and without entirely deciding to let the pendulum loose. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The sound itself was ordinary, but through the wood under my fingertips resting on the floor beside it, there came the faintest pulse. Not loud, not dramatic. A transfer. Ellen's face had gone pale again. Jesus. No, I said automatically, though, whether in denial or correction, I could not have said. The house gave us another memory then, because memory in old houses is contagious. You uncover one mechanism, and the rest begin to volunteer themselves. All at once I saw Marjorie in this hall, not crying, not frightened visibly, but moving with that odd brisk gentleness Ellen had named. Martin in the parlor below speaking in his low, even way, my own newspaper open in the dining room, and Marjorie pausing here at the console, lifting the metronome, setting it down again, 2 fingers on the wood, as if checking its place. At the time I had thought she was tidying while guests were over. That had been her way, keep the edges of a house composed while conversation occupied the center. Now I was no longer sure what center she had been composing for. The phone book in the desk room still held numbers written by hand in the back pages, though most were outdated. Laura Bell was not there. Daniel, my son-in-law, found her in 20 minutes online because the internet has reduced much of human searching to embarrassment. She lived in Worthington, retired, no listed email, 1 landline. I called from the kitchen because I could not bear to speak to another witness in the hall outside that wall. She answered on the 6th ring. "Hello, Mrs. Bell, Laura Bell." "Yes. My name is Thomas Mercer. Tom Mercer. I'm not sure you'll remember me, but my wife Marjorie knew you some years back." A pause. Then Marjorie Mercer from Bexley. The fact that she remembered at once did something unpleasant to me. "Yes." Another pause, shorter this time, but full enough to feel chosen. "I'm sorry to hear the past tense," she said. "I didn't know. She died last year." "I'm very sorry." "Thank you." I looked out the kitchen window at the bare side yard because I could not say the next sentence facing inward. "Mrs. Bell, I found something in my house today, or rather, a contractor did. I have a paper here with your name on it in my wife's hand, a photocopy about visual supports for hearing-impaired children." Silence. Not startled silence. Not confused silence. A listening silence. The kind that made the skin between my shoulder blades tighten. "I see," she said. That was all. I gripped the receiver harder. "Did my wife ask you for something, Mr. Mercer?" she said carefully. "What exactly did you find?" The care in her voice made me feel suddenly foolish and endangered at once. I gave her the minimum: the opened wall, the hidden cards, the metronome, the photocopy. On the other end of the line, I heard not panic, but one controlled inhale. "When did you say Marjorie died?" "Last December. And the space you found this was in an interior wall, near the nursery." My eyes shut. "Yes, I think," she said, choosing each word as though testing it for splinters, "that I should not discuss this on the telephone beyond saying that your wife asked me some questions several years ago that struck me as oddly specific at the time. She never gave me a name. She never described a child directly, but what you're describing now." Another pause. "Mr. Mercer, I can come by tomorrow morning if you want me to." I should have asked why she sounded unsurprised. I should have demanded whether she knew what had happened under my roof. Instead, I said, "Yes." "Will you be alone?" The question hit me in a raw place. "No. My daughter is here." "Good." Her voice softened, but not in comfort. Indecision. "Then I'll come." "And Mr. Mercer?" "Yes. Until then, don't decide what story makes the least noise. Wait for the facts." After I hung up, I stood with the receiver still in my hand and stared at nothing until Ellen came in. "What did she say?" "She's coming tomorrow." "That's all." "That's enough." But it was not enough. It was exactly the opposite. Laura Bell's restraint had done something worse than alarm could have done. It had conferred weight. The private warning scene came just after 6, when the sky outside had gone indigo and the house had entered that hour Marjorie used to call the in-between, when every room asks whether it is for living or remembering. Evan and Louise had gone. The exposed wall openings were covered in thick plastic sheeting for the night, taped at the edges. Through it, the bedroom looked diseased. The nursery closet stood empty. Ellen was on the phone in the dining room with Daniel, keeping her voice low but clipped. I could hear my own name. Martin's name, then silence while she listened. I took the metronome into the parlor without thinking. The front parlor had always been Marjorie's stage for company, though she disliked the word stage and would have called it simply the front room. Good lamplight, no television proper, chairs, one table strong enough for a pie plate, the mantel kept spare. Martin Vale had sat in that room many times. So had neighbors after funerals, choir members after services. Ellen with one baby asleep on her shoulder. Daniel, too careful at first, my grandson building forts from sofa cushions before being taught this was not the room for that. I set the metronome on the parlor table and stood over it as if it might confess something under pressure. The room smelled of old books, furniture polish, and the faint cold from the front windows. On the lower shelf of the side table beside Martin's usual chair sat a stack of old church bulletins waiting to be recycled. I had not touched them in months. Now one detail rose out of them and struck me so hard I bent down to look closer. The chair. It was turned a few degrees more toward the archway than the others. That meant nothing in itself. Chairs drift. People move them. Vacuuming shifts them. But some animal part of me had already become intolerant of small meanings. I walked to the opposite chair and compared the legs against the rug pattern, then back again. Martin's old chair had been angled to see more of the hall. I heard Ellen in the dining room end the call and come toward me. She stopped in the archway. "What is it?" I didn't answer. I was looking past the chair now through the line of the room toward the staircase and the partial view into the downstairs hall. From that seat, a person could see who came down, who went up, whether anyone crossed toward the back. The memory that came next was so specific it made me feel ill. One rainy Thursday, Martin sitting just there, cup in hand, telling me some long story about a parish couple with money troubles. Marjorie standing by the piano, listening but not participating, then moving behind him and nudging that chair one careful inch with her shin while pretending to straighten the rug. I had smiled at the fussiness of it. She had said lightly, "You're crooked." Martin laughed and shifted back. At the time, I heard hostess correction. Tonight, I heard line of sight. Dad, Ellen said again. I turned. She came into the room and shut the pocket door halfway behind her, reducing the house to a whisper. What are you doing? I lowered my voice too, though there was no one left to overhear. This chair. She looked at it, then at me. Then, because she was quicker than I had ever given her proper credit for in matters like this, she looked through the room as I had been looking. Oh, she said, do you remember him sitting there? Yes. Do you remember your mother moving it? Her gaze sharpened into memory. I remember thinking she was being rude once. Why? Because she kept making excuses to cross in front of him. Ellen stepped near and put a hand on the chair back. Tray, coasters, napkin, candle. She never left him alone in here long. I used to think she just didn't like the way he talked. There are discoveries that tell you what happened and discoveries that tell you what you were. This was the latter. Every one of them cost differently. I sat down in the chair Martin used to occupy. From there, the room looked welcoming, balanced, ordinary, and impossible to trust. Ellen moved closer, then crouched by my knee the way she had when she was a child, bringing me a broken toy she hoped I could mend. She spoke so quietly, I could barely hear her. Dad, I need you to hear me without defending anybody for 1 minute. I looked at her. I don't know exactly what Mom was doing, she whispered. I don't know exactly why. But whatever it was, she was not just being private. She was organizing around something, and if Martin's name keeps showing up in my head, it's because he kept showing up in this house on the same kind of days she got strange. Strange. You know what I mean. Yes, I knew. The trouble was that knowing had begun to split into categories. What I knew as fact, what I knew as pattern, what I knew as accusation, what I knew as the shape of my own avoidance. I need more than your head, I said. I know. But if you are right, she looked down. I know. And if you are wrong, you're staining a dead woman's choices and a living man's name with what memory? Her whisper sharpened. Dad, whose comfort are you trying to preserve? The question landed so cleanly I had no answer ready, only offense. Yet even offense felt flimsy against the room. I said because it was the last ground left Martin was trusted. Ellen's eyes filled so suddenly it changed her whole face. Not with weeping, with fury held too long in a good woman's body. That she said in a whisper, rougher than a shout, is exactly what scares me. She stood up and went back to the dining room before I could answer. I sat alone in Martin Vale's chair until the dark finished gathering at the windows. That night I slept badly and in pieces, not from fear in the ordinary sense. Fear is too straightforward a word for what a house can do once it has shown you that routine had a second meaning all along. I kept waking not to sounds, but to arrangements. The bedside lamp, the bureau mirror, the shadow of the plastic sheeting over the opened wall shifting with the furnace. Each time I opened my eyes, I had to remember which facts belonged to the present and which were only newly damaged memories. At some point after 2, I got up and went into the hall in my robe. The metronome stood where I had left it on the console. The moonlight through the nursery window made a dull blade across its face. The house smelled of plaster old cotton and the faint medicinal chill that comes when heating ducts run through cold walls. Without really deciding to, I went to the linen passage. The cupboard tags hung straight. The towel shelf with the missing rectangular absence waited in its ordinary order. I touched the shelf back where dust had not settled, and finally understood what had been stored there. Folded towels, yes, but not only towels. The blank strip was too tall. Something else had stood behind them for cover. I bent and looked at the bottom shelf where Marjorie kept odd old household things in clear shoeboxes. Candle stubs, furniture glides, mending kits, spare hooks. Behind one box pushed far back was a brown paper package tied with cotton string. I took it down. Inside were 6 white towels, thinned from washing, each marked with a tiny blue cross sewn. Into one corner. Not store embroidery, hand-sewn, intentional. Marjorie's work again. I sat down on the hallway runner with the towels in my lap. A memory came at once, and it hurt because it had once been comic. I had teased her years ago about sewing little marks into perfectly good household linen like some Depression-era quartermaster. She had said because sometimes it matters which set goes where. I asked what on earth that meant. She answered with a look over her shoulder. I had read as playful dismissal. It means leave my towels alone and go read your paper. Sometimes it matters which set goes where. I pressed my hand hard against my eyes. When you discover that domestic sentences were instructions in another war, grief becomes something sharper than missing. It becomes belated literacy. By morning, I had achieved that special exhaustion in which the body feels old and the mind feels childish. Ellen arrived at 8 with bakery muffins I could not eat, and Daniel just behind her in a navy overcoat with legal caution already in his face. He listened while we showed him the wall, the cards, the photocopy, the marked volunteer schedule, the towels with blue crosses, the metronome. Daniel did not say much. He had the good sense of a man who knows that facts in raw form should not be padded prematurely by reassurance. When I finished, he asked only who else knows besides the contractor, me and Laura Bell. No one. Good. Good, I said. It means the story still belongs to the evidence. I almost snapped at him. Instead, I heard in the dryness of his answer a kind of respect. He was not treating me as fragile. He was treating the situation as dangerous in the adult way, where danger means not panic, but sequence. Laura Bell arrived at 9:10. I recognized her at once, though age had sharpened and pared her into something even more exact than before. 70-something now, silver hair cut close at the jaw, camel coat, flat shoes, leather satchel. Her face had the look I have come to trust in certain older women, not softness, not severity, but a refusal to waste either. She shook my hand with both of hers. I'm sorry for the reason we're meeting again, Mr. Mercer. So am I. She followed us upstairs without small talk. I watched her as she entered the hall and saw the metronome before anything else. Not the opened wall, not the plastic, the metronome. Her expression did not change much, but it deepened in the slightest way, like a page taking on water. In here, Ellen said. Laura went first to the bedroom wall opening. She did not crowd it. She stood back, taking in the ledge, the cards, the padded studs, the vent holes, the enamel cup on the dresser. Then she crossed to the nursery closet opening and touched the edge of the fitted panel with 2 fingers. After that, she asked to see the photocopy sheet. Then the cardigan, then the towels with the blue crosses, then the metronome. Not one comment yet. At last, she carried the metronome into the nursery and set it on the bare floorboards just inside the doorway. She let the pendulum swing and then crouched fingertips on the wood. No one spoke. After half a minute, she looked up at me. Did Marjorie ever ask you to stay downstairs with company while she was up here? She said. The question was so specific it made the room contract. I don't know, I said. Maybe. Why? Laura stood. Because this is not decorative adaptation, she said. It's functional, repeated, thought through. The cards are not random comfort aids. The room arrangement, the softened contact points the felt under the metronome, the visual symbols, whatever was being marked on those studs. This was designed so a child with significant hearing loss could understand routine and safety without spoken instruction. The words were clear. Their meaning took a second longer to enter. A deaf child, Ellen said. Laura nodded once, or nearly deaf, enough that visual support and vibration mattered. I heard Daniel exhale behind me. My first reaction was not revelation, but offense of a very tired, very human kind. You sound certain. Laura turned to me. I am certain about what these tools are for. I'm less certain about circumstances because your wife never gave me names. You spoke to her? Yes. When? Several years ago. She looked down at the cardigan in her hands. She called after a church outreach event, asked if I would answer some general questions. Very general at first. How to communicate urgent instructions to a child who might not hear well under stress. Whether tactile signals could be made consistent in a home. How to help a frightened child understand that a certain room was safe without making a spectacle of it. The room changed temperature. I said, "And you didn't ask why I did ask." She said she was helping someone privately and did not trust systems to move fast enough. That's all. Laura's gaze held mine with enough steadiness that I felt absurdly like a student attempting vagueness with a good teacher. No, Mr. Mercer. That was not all, but it was all she would give me. The old humiliation rose again. Marjorie had consulted another person, not me, not her husband standing 10 feet away in the same house where this had happened. Another person. I heard myself say, "Why not me?" No one answered, because the question was not for them. Laura looked at the wall opening again. "May I ask something difficult?" Daniel said quietly. "You may." She ignored him and kept her attention on me. Was there anyone who came into the house regularly during that period whom Marjorie may have felt unable to challenge openly? I knew in that instant that she already suspected the answer. The house around us seemed to lean closer to listen. I said after too long, "Martinvale." Laura's face did not register surprise, only sorrow sharpened by confirmation. Ellen made a sound in her throat. "How do you know his name?" I asked. "I know it the same way you do," Laura said. "By pattern, before proof. He referred children for church assistance programs. He inserted himself into family crises under pastoral cover. There were no charges, if that's what you're asking. There were concerns. Hushed ones, never enough to survive a respectable room." She held the cardigan a little tighter. "And your wife's questions became more urgent after one particular spring." That spring. The phrase itself opened a trap door under me. I saw with hideous clarity the parlor windows cracked for air, Martin's umbrella in the stand, Marjorie carrying a tray with her mouth set too carefully. The metronome moved out to the hall. The nursery door closed. My own certainty that whatever currents existed between church women and clergy politics were none of my concern, so long as everybody remained civil. Every important reveal costs a man something. This one cost me a clean memory. "I need something more than pattern," I said, but the sentence came out thin and already wounded. Laura looked at the hidden cards spread on the bed, then back at me. "Mr. Mercer," she said gently, "I am giving you professional interpretation, not accusation." These were supports for a deaf child. The tactile logic is unmistakable. Your wife was not improvising comfort. She was building a system. The question is not whether. The question is why. Daniel stepped in then, not aggressively, but with the practical caution of his trade. "Mrs. Bell, did Marjorie ever describe immediate danger?" "Anything reportable." Laura considered that. "Not directly." "She described urgency without disclosure, which in hindsight I regret accepting." "Did she ask about signs, signals, or hiding specifically?" "Yes." The word landed like a dropped tool. "In what terms?" Daniel asked. Laura set the cardigan down and opened her satchel. From it, she removed a thin manila folder, old and worn soft at the edges. "I brought something I wasn't sure I'd show anyone," she said. "Not because it was confidential in any enforceable sense, but because I'm old enough to know that paper without context can do harm. This is my note from our second conversation. I wrote it because her questions were unusual." She handed the folder to me. Inside was one lined notepad sheet in a compact, slanted hand. Near the top was Marjorie's first name and a date. Beneath it, adult female asking about home-based visual/tactile supports for older child with severe hearing loss. Anxious temperament needs, silent reassurance/predictable movement. Wants room signal system, concerned about approach/access/certain visitor. No names given. Emphasized child must not be startled. Asked whether rhythmic floor signal could indicate safe passage. The page blurred. I did not cry. Grief has 1,000 respectable masks in old men, but tears are not always among them. What came instead was a sensation like blood pulling backward in the body. Certain visitor. Marjorie had used that phrase with another woman while I was still sitting in my own dining room, believing no doubt that I was protecting the household by being hospitable. I turned the page over absurdly, hoping for more and fearing it. There was one line on the back boxed separately, probably written later. Suggested visual cards. Do not involve child in repeated retelling if avoidable. I handed the note to Daniel because my fingers had begun to feel clumsy. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Laura very quietly said, "Your wife was asking how to make a house communicate without sound." Those words may have been the true midpoint of everything, not because they told me the whole story, but because they ended forever. The lesser explanation I had been nursing since yesterday, that Marjorie had briefly helped some frightened child for reasons of gossip, modesty, or temporary family trouble and kept it from me to avoid household dispute. No, she had consulted, planned, modified architecture, marked towels, used symbols, repaired a metronome for floor vibration, hidden practical tools in a wall and behind a closet. She had built language into the rooms. That is not what a woman does because she fears gossip. It is what a woman does because she fears failure. I went into the bedroom and sat on the cedar chest because my legs no longer trusted me. From there I could see the wall opening the bed, the dresser, the shadowed nursery beyond. Marjorie had slept 6 feet from that wall, turned down those sheets, folded my shirts in this room, laid out church clothes here, stood at this mirror pinning earrings into place. And on some number of evenings I had gone downstairs or out to the garage or off to bed, believing we were living inside the same story. My shame by then had stopped being theoretical. It had acquired furniture. Ellen came in after a minute and shut the bedroom door almost fully behind her. Her face had softened. That was somehow worse than anger. She sat beside me on the cedar chest, not touching it first. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what?" "For the way this is happening. It happened a long time ago." "You know what I mean." Yes, I knew. The dust smell was still in the room, but now another scent had risen from the open cavity. Lavender, faint and dry, as if one sachet or another had once been placed back there and forgotten. Marjorie used lavender in linen cupboards, never excessively, just enough so clean things felt attended to. The smell in that hidden space undid me more than the note had, because it meant she had tried to make even concealment carry something gentle. I should have seen something I said. Ellen did not rush to absolve me. God bless her for that. After a moment she said, "Maybe. But not because you were stupid." "Then why?" She looked down at her hands. "Because good manners are blinding if you trust them too much." That was such a Marjorie sentence I nearly turned my head, expecting to hear it in her voice instead. A late wife memory came then. Not one I had forgotten, but one I had misfiled under married irritation. Martin had once stood in our kitchen after a church dinner pickup and complimented the order of our home. Said with that soft, admiring smile of his, "Marjorie, your rooms always feel so peaceful." She had been drying a soup pot. Without looking up, she said, "Peaceful rooms take work." Martin laughed, and I laughed with him, because what else was it but a housewife's tartness? Now I heard the line differently. Not pride. Warning. Statement of cost. Peaceful rooms take work. I sat in the bedroom where she had engineered peace with signals and towels and felt pads and nearly hated myself for the years it took me to hear her plain speech. Laura came to the doorway an hour later, holding the metronome. "May I show you one more thing?" she asked. She set it on the bedroom floor just inside the wall opening and began the pendulum swinging. Then she crouched and pressed her palm to the narrow ledge inside the cavity. "Feel this," she said. I knelt stiffly and put my fingers where she indicated. Through the wood came the pulse. Slight, steady, much clearer near the wall than it had been in the open hall. "If the house is quiet," Laura said, "and the child is trained to expect meaning from rhythm. This could tell her many things. that someone safe is near, that time is passing, that she should wait, that she may move soon. The ledge under my fingers felt worn smoother in one place, as if a hand had rested there often. I pulled mine away. What child? I asked. This, more than anything, had been haunting the edges of everything. We were all speaking around a specific absence, as if politeness still governed the room. Child, girl, someone small, but not a person. Laura straightened slowly. I don't know for certain, she said. I have a suspicion. There was a girl named Rachel Doyle. Church outreach linked her aunt with temporary assistance. Profound loss in one ear, significant impairment in the other. Very bright, very withdrawn. I saw her only once in a school consultation because the placement shifted so quickly. Then the file went cold. Daniel, who had been reading Laura's note downstairs, looked up sharply from the hall. Cold how she disappeared from district contact before services were stabilized. That happens more often than it should when caretaking gets improvised through churches and relatives. Laura's mouth flattened. At the time I assumed bureaucracy. Now I'm less charitable. Doyle, I repeated because names are anchors, even when they drag. Ellen said. Did Mom know her? Laura answered carefully. I think your mother knew enough to be frightened. Then she looked directly at me. And in that look there was something finally beyond interpretation. Not accusation, not sympathy. Recognition. The recognition one adult gives another when the facts have become morally directional, whether or not all details are in hand. She said very quietly, and the whole upstairs seemed to listen for it. She wasn't hiding the child from noise. She was hiding her from a person. She wasn't hiding the child from noise. She was hiding her from a person. No one moved after Laura said it. The words did not land all at once. They moved through the room in stages, touching each object differently. The metronome first, then the wall opening, then the old nursery bed with its blue coverlet, then the cedar chest at the foot of my marriage bed where I was still sitting as if furniture could grant some form of jurisdiction over what had happened in my own house. The only sound was the pendulum still ticking on the floor near the wall. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It went on a few beats too long before Ellen bent and stopped it. That silence felt worse. Laura Bell stood with her satchel hanging from one hand, not looking triumphant, not looking especially pleased to have been right. Her face had the closed, steady expression of a person who had seen enough of other people's avoidances to know that certainty is often a burden more than a victory. Daniel stood in the hall with his legal pad against one palm, his eyes on the note Laura had brought, though it was obvious he was no longer reading it. I heard myself ask. What person? Laura did not answer immediately. She looked at Ellen first, then Daniel, and then back at me. I can tell you what the evidence suggests, she said. I cannot tell you what I did not witness. That's not what I asked. No, she said. It isn't. There was no impatience in her voice. That almost made it harder to bear. My daughter said quietly, Dad. I turned to her. She had my wife's posture, just then shoulders squared without stiffness, hands held very still like a person determined not to let a room govern her breathing. But the eyes were her own. Ellen did not have Marjorie's reserve in her gaze. When she looked at you, you knew she had already chosen not to flatter you with easier weather. Say his name, she said. The room seemed to shift a fraction of an inch under that. I looked down at the floorboards. The place where Laura had set the metronome still held the faintest indentation in the dust, a small, square footprint under each felted foot. Not sound anymore. Evidence. Martin, I said. And it felt like dragging a familiar object through mud. You think Martin Vale. Laura did not rescue the sentence from me. I think your wife structured her house around the possibility that one specific visitor should not be left with access. The old pastoral title that used to rise naturally in my mind, Reverend, did not come. That absence itself told me something. Daniel, who had been mostly quiet, stepped into the room at last. Tom, we need to slow down and separate what we know from what we infer. I almost snapped at him for using my name that way professionally, but there was no condescension in it. Only caution, which in a moment like that is the closest thing decency has to muscle. What do we know? I asked. He ticked them off without looking at his notes. We know Marjorie engineered a hidden child-sized shelter space accessible from this wall in the nursery closet. We know the setup included visual supports and tactile signaling consistent with helping a hearing-impaired child stay silent-oriented and calm. We know Laura consulted with her and documented references to a certain visitor and a child not being startled. We know your daughter remembers Marjorie behaving fearfully on visits when Martin Vale was in the house. We know Martin had routine access to the house under church cover, and we infer I said that my wife was hiding a deaf child from a man I welcomed into my parlor. Daniel met my eyes. Yes. There was a clean brutality in hearing it said plain. Laura folded the note back into her folder. I should go, she said. You have enough for one day. No, I said too quickly. If you know anything else, anything at all, you tell me now. She paused. Then, with visible reluctance, she said, I know one more thing that may matter. A few weeks after Marjorie called me the second time, she rang again and asked a stranger question. She asked whether a child might learn to identify safety by vibration alone if speech was not dependable. Laura looked toward the wall. At the time, I found that oddly phrased. Now, I think she meant not that the child couldn't hear words, but that words around her might not be safe to trust. That hit me with an intimacy almost worse than the larger implication, because it meant Marjorie had understood that language itself in this house could be compromised. Reassurance from the wrong mouth, kindness used as access, invitations that were not safe invitations. My own voice, for all I knew, I said. Did she sound frightened? Laura considered that. She sounded precise, which is often how frightened women sound when they've decided no one will be allowed to call them emotional. Marjorie had always been precise. The trouble with old love is that once it begins to reconfigure under truth, every remembered virtue can turn double. Her orderliness, which had once made our household feel cared for, now seemed also like camouflage. Her calmness, which I had admired, might have been partly an instrument of emergency. Her hospitality may not have been hospitality at all on some evenings, only management under observation. Laura left a few minutes later. Ellen walked her out. Daniel went downstairs to make a phone call. I did not ask about, though I knew he was already stepping into that narrow professional corridor where outrage must be filtered into sequence if it is to matter later. I remained upstairs alone in the nursery. The room did not feel haunted. I need to say that because lesser stories would lie there for effect. Nothing in the house had become supernatural. What had changed was worse and more adult than that. The room had become legible in a new language, and I was illiterate in it by my own previous choice. I stood in the center of the nursery floor and looked around. The little brass bed by the wall, the shelf of board books, the framed alphabet print above the nightstand, the wardrobe slightly heavier than the room required standing near the closet as if it had been placed there for balance. The metronome on the floorboards near the wall opening, the plastic sheeting over the broken plaster in the bedroom beyond. All of it ordinary enough that another man might still have mistaken it for old family clutter and tasteful maintenance. All of it altered now by purpose. I went to the wardrobe first. It was a maple piece Marjorie had bought at an estate sale 20 years ago because she said every house needed one solid thing that had already lived elsewhere. Too large for children's clothes, really. We used it for spare blankets, dress-up things when the grandchildren were little winter throws in summer. I opened its doors. The cedar smell came up immediately, that familiar dry, almost medicinal clean scent. Shelves lined with paper, a folded quilt, 2 boxed puzzles, a stack of extra pillow forms. I got down on one knee and looked at the feet. There they were. Long scrape lines in the old oak floor beneath the front legs, not from one move long ago, but from repeated short adjustments, back and forth, inches at a time. I sat back on my heels. Marjorie had moved this wardrobe again and again. Not because she was redecorating, because sightlines mattered. When I rose, I did so with a kind of stiff, deliberate care I had not felt all week. Pain will sometimes age a man abruptly. Clarity can do the opposite. Something in me, some weak and grieving domestic part, that had wanted only to preserve what remained, had begun giving ground to another part I had not used properly in months. The part that had once managed classrooms full of difficult boys without raising my voice. The part that had learned over decades that the first duty in any crisis was not emotion, but arrangement. I opened the wardrobe fully and dragged it 3 inches to the left. From the doorway of the room, the angle changed. The closet opening and the hall could no longer be seen together from the parlor side. I moved it back, 3 inches the other way, clear line down the hall. I looked through the room toward the parlor arch, imagining Martin Vale, seated where he had often sat, cup in hand, soft voice steady. And for the first time I understood something so humiliating I had to grip the wardrobe door to stay still. My wife had not merely hidden a child from him. She had hidden a child around me, not because she thought I would side with him. I do not believe that even now. That would be too clean a condemnation. No, far worse than that. She had hidden the child around me because she could not trust me to read the room fast enough, coldly enough against a man I had already admitted into my understanding of goodness. That was the deeper betrayal inside the family. And it did not come from Martin first. It came from the collapse of my usefulness in the exact moral territory where a husband ought to be most useful. I sat down on the nursery floor. The old floorboards were cold through my trousers. A splinter of afternoon light fell across the alphabet print and stopped at the wardrobe leg. From downstairs came the muffled sound of Ellen closing a cupboard too hard and then pausing, probably ashamed of the noise. I knew that pattern in my children well. All of us had learned to correct volume before we had learned to correct truth. I do not know how long I sat there. At some point, Daniel came up and leaned one shoulder against the nursery door frame. "You all right?" he asked. It was not a stupid question, though it had a stupid answer available. "No," I said. He nodded once. "Good." I looked up at him. "Good. It means you're past pretending this is manageable by sentiment." His tone was not cruel. Daniel was not a cruel man. He was, however, a prosecutor long enough to know how often sorrow tries to disguise itself as carefulness when what it really wants is delay. I said, "What are you doing on the phone? Checking whether Vale is still officially attached to pastoral counseling through the church or operating informally now? And informally mostly. Which makes some things easier and some things harder." I got to my feet. "I want everything in this house that puts him here." Daniel's eyes sharpened. "What kind of everything? Photographs? Bulletins? Calendars? Guest books if your mother-in-law kept them? I want dates. I want rooms. I want where he sat and when." That was the first deliberate strategic move I made, though I did not think of it that way then. I thought of it as anger finally becoming useful. Daniel watched me for a second, reassessing. "All right," he said. "Then we build a timeline." By 4:30, the dining room had become an evidence room without ever ceasing to be my dining room, and that was perhaps the most disturbing transformation of all. Marjorie's good walnut table was covered with ordered stacks. Church schedules, family photo albums, old holiday snapshots. Laura Bell's note now in a clear sleeve Daniel had found in his briefcase. The visual support photocopy, the towel bundle with blue crosses, the laminated cards, the cardigan with the bead in its cuff, a legal pad down the center where Daniel, with maddeningly neat handwriting, made columns for date event room visitors. Marjorie behavior, known child support clue. Ellen brewed coffee none of us drank. The smell of it mingled with paper dust, old wood, and the faint mineral tang still drifting down from the opened wall upstairs. Outside, evening came on damp and early. The window over the buffet reflected us back at ourselves, one widower, one daughter, one son-in-law, bent over the remains of respectable life like people reading wartime code. The first photograph that mattered was from Easter supper 7 years ago. Martin Vale stood near the parlor arch in a pale grey sport coat, smiling at someone out of frame, one hand around a plate, the other half lifted as if in blessing or conversation. Behind him, barely noticeable until you knew to look, was the line through the hall and the edge of the nursery door upstairs caught in the angle of a mirror over the entry table. It was absurdly little. And yet there it was again, position, orientation, access. The second was worse. A casual summer picture Ellen had taken of Marjorie bringing lemonade into the front room while Martin sat in his usual chair. I was visible only by one shoulder near the piano, but what mattered was not any of us. It was the chair itself, angled, not randomly, deliberately, and Marjorie's hand on the tray knuckles white. "Zoom that one," Daniel said. Ellen took the picture into the kitchen for better light and came back with her jaw clenched. "You can see she's looking past him," she said. "Not at him, past him, toward the hall. Every important reveal cost me differently. This one cost me the last casual innocence of family photographs." Then came Ellen's memory, fuller this time, because once we gave the past a shape, more of it agreed to show itself. She was 16, maybe just turned. Rainy afternoon. Martin in the parlor. I was home, but downstairs, likely in the study with bills, or in the kitchen because there had been some conversation about church roof estimates, and I still handled practical things I could quantify. Ellen had run halfway up the stairs for a cardigan. Marjorie appeared, placed both hands on her shoulders, and guided her back down with that urgent gentleness. But there was more. "What more?" I said. Ellen shut her eyes. Mom touched the wall. "Which wall?" "The hallway. Upstairs, near the console table." She opened her eyes. She tapped it. I remember because I thought she was just trying to get my attention while smiling. Tap, tap. I looked at the metronome where it sat at the far end of the table among the piles. Daniel said quietly, "Like a signal." Ellen looked ill. "I don't know." "Maybe." But she did it more than once. Not hard, just enough. A signal sent through wood, through floor, through wall. At some point you stop needing the clues to be explained to you. At some point you begin explaining them to yourself, and that is both power and punishment. By 6 I knew enough to be dangerous and not enough to be effective. That is one of the worst positions a man can occupy. I stood at the end of the dining room table and looked down the columns Daniel had made. Church outreach nights, grief counseling visits, home support, Thursdays heavy in spring, Marjorie's marked initials beside some of them, my own calendar entries from the same time history department, dinner booster club meeting, parent conferences, a school board, town hall. I had not been absent all those nights. That was part of what made it personal. Sometimes I was in the house, sometimes only one room away. "What if he never did anything in front of me because he knew he didn't have to?" I said. Neither Ellen nor Daniel answered. I asked it again to the room this time. What if the whole point was that he didn't have to? That was the moment I fully understood Martin's frightening quality. It was not force. It was confidence in the social intelligence of good rooms. His power had rested partly on his certainty that no one wanted ugliness enough to interrupt civility on suspicion alone. He did not need ranting speeches or overt menace. He needed chairs angled correctly, doors left respectfully ajar, a husband flattered by moral language, and a wife forced into precision instead of alarm. It was then that I made my second deliberate move. "I'm calling him," I said. Ellen looked up so fast her chair legs scraped. "No." Daniel was calmer, but no less firm. "Not yet. I'm not accusing him. I'm asking him over. For what I looked at the parlor doorway, to see how he stands in this house when he thinks it still belongs to his old story." Daniel put down his pen. "Tom, I know the difference between bait and conversation." "Do you?" Ellen said. I turned on her more sharply than I meant to. Yes. The hurt on her face came and went quickly, replaced by something harder. Mom probably thought so too. That shut me up. Daniel got up and came around the table. "Look at me," he said. "I did. If you bring him in now, before we know who this child was, before we have anything living, anything outside the walls and the patterns, he can shape the next move. He's had years of practice at that. You've had one day. I'm not helpless." "No," Daniel said quietly. "You're not. Which is why you wait until waiting strengthens you." That landed because it was true and because I hated that it was true. I did not call Martinvale that night. Instead, we went after the child. Laura's suspicion about Rachel Doyle gave us a name and a corridor. Daniel used public records where he could, and old professional contacts where he couldn't. Church outreach paperwork named an aunt, then lost her. A school district intake record from 6 years ago placed Rachel temporarily in a church-linked support address for exactly 8 days in April before the file ended. Not closed. Ended. The phrase temporary family arrangement appeared in a margin. No follow-up educational placement until a different district 2 years later. Daniel worked the chain, patiently talking low from the kitchen with a county clerk he knew, then with someone in public defender's records, then with another person whose name he did not volunteer. By 9:30, he had an address in Grove City and a current employer attached to it, County Library, branch assistant Rachel A. Doyle. Ellen let out a breath that sounded almost like fear. I said, "We go tonight." "No," Daniel said. "We ask first. Ask how he looked at me then at the house around us. By mail." The idea struck me as insulting in its smallness. Mail. After walls and cards and hidden children and all the rest, we were to approach the truth by envelope like polite debtors. Then I understood. A phone call can be ignored, denied, startled against. A visit can feel like pursuit. A letter lets a person decide whether to open the past on her own floor. "You write it," Daniel said. "Why me?" "Because if she ever trusted this house at all, it won't be because of me. There are humiliations that strip a man and humiliations that instruct him. This one did both." I sat at Marjorie's desk with one sheet of cream paper in front of me and tried to write to a woman I had probably failed as a child before I knew she existed. The desk lamp cast a gold circle over the paper. Outside its light, the room went soft and dim. The house had grown strange by then in ways too specific to dismiss. The front parlor seemed over-arranged, the hall runner muffled footsteps too efficiently. The nursery door left open now made the upper landing feel exposed from angles I had never considered. Even the clock in the kitchen sounded less like time and more like counting. I wrote 4 drafts and tore them all up. The first sounded legal. The second sounded self-excusing. The third sounded sentimental, which is the coward's route when facts hurt. The fourth was too vague. At last, I wrote Ms. Doyle. "My name is Thomas Mercer. You may not remember me, though you may remember my wife, Marjorie Mercer, or our house in Bexley. Work on our upstairs wall has uncovered evidence that my wife hid and protected a child in this home some years ago. I believe that child may have been you. I am writing because I have learned enough to know that my wife was trying to keep someone safe, and enough to fear that I did not understand what was happening in my own house when it mattered. I am sorry for that, whether or not I understood it then. You do not owe me an answer, but if you are willing to speak, I would be grateful. I am trying to understand what my wife carried here and why. Thomas Mercer." I did not sign it Tom. If she remembered anything about that house, my first name had no claim on familiarity. Daniel read it once and handed it back without amendment. Ellen read it and cried finally, but only for 3 seconds, and only with her head turned away. We mailed it first thing the next morning by priority delivery because ordinary speed had become intolerable. The waiting after that was the hardest part of Part 3, though at the time I did not think in acts. I thought only in rooms. The house had turned deceptive by then, not in fantasy, in habit. Every time I passed the hall console and saw the metronome, I remembered not music but pulse. Every time I went into the linen passage, the shelf with the blue cross towels seemed to contain accusation in its neatness. The parlor chair Martin favored made me physically uneasy. So on the second day, I turned it straight with the others and felt absurdly as if I had taken back 1 inch of territory. Then I hated myself for finding satisfaction in furniture while a child's fear had once lived in the same geometry. One of the most memorable suspense scenes of those days happened on the second night near midnight, when the house revealed one more layer, not through discovery but through reenactment. I could not sleep. That had become common enough not to mention. The upstairs was dark except for the nightlight in the hall socket, one of those low amber things Marjorie bought after Ellen's daughter was born, so no one would trip on midnight visits. I stood outside the nursery and looked down the hall toward the staircase. The house hummed softly in its old wiring way. Heat clicked in the radiators. Somewhere a gutter ticked after rain. I did not intend to test anything, but I went into the nursery, set the metronome on the floor near the wall opening, and started it. Then I stepped into the parlor downstairs and sat in Martin's old chair. The line from that seat through the archway through the hall up toward the landing was cleaner than I had imagined. Not perfect, not theatrical, clean enough, a man in that chair would not see into the hidden cavity. That had never been the point. He would see movement, doors, shadows, delays, whether someone came down when expected, whether a hostess was occupied too long upstairs. Tick, tock. Faint at first, then clearer through the floor and wall structure, a pulse moved in the room. I sat there in the dark parlor, hearing the metronome above me and feeling its rhythm as if the house were tapping from the past, and understood with cold certainty that the upstairs and downstairs had once spoken to each other around me. Not because, Marjorie was deceitful by nature, because she had to build a second conversation inside the first. The front room had never felt more hostile, and nothing in it had changed except my comprehension. I went upstairs and stopped the metronome with both hands, as if I owed the house that much. The letter was delivered on Thursday at 10:14 a.m. Daniel tracked that because Daniel tracked everything. By noon there was no response. By 4, none. By evening, still none. I told myself that silence was rational. I told myself that any woman with sense would mistrust an unexpected letter from the widower of the house that had once hidden her. I told myself many correct things that did not make waiting easier. On Friday morning, Rachel Doyle called. I answered on the second ring. "Mr. Mercer." Her voice was lower than I had expected, not frail, not trembling, very controlled, a person who had practiced letting little leak out over the years. "Yes, this is Rachel Doyle." I gripped the receiver too hard. "Thank you for calling." Silence. "Then I kept your letter by the toaster for a day and a half before I opened it. The image was so plain it pierced me. Somebody's ordinary kitchen, somebody's life continuing around old dread." "I understand," I said. "No," she said not harshly. "I don't think you do. But maybe you want to." There was no defense possible against that. "I do," I said. Another pause. "You found the wall," she said. "Yes. And the cards." "Yes." The metronome. The fact that she named it before I did tightened something in my throat. "Yes." I heard her exhale through her nose. Not a sob, more like a person absorbing impact while determined to remain vertical. "I can meet," she said. "Not there. We're public first." We settled on a library meeting room the next day. Neutral, daylight, no surprises. After I hung up, I stood for a long moment with my hand still on the phone cradle. Then I went to the dining room where Ellen and Daniel were waiting from the look on their faces. They had read the answer in me before I spoke. "She called," I said. Ellen put a hand over her mouth. "She'll meet," I said. "Not here. Public first." Daniel only nodded, but some tension moved out of his shoulders. Good. It was not enough for me. I said I want to bring something. What? Ellen asked. I looked toward the hall. The metronome. Both of them stared at me. Tom Daniels said carefully that maybe too much. She named it first. That doesn't mean she wants to see it. No, I said. But if it mattered to her, it may tell her I'm not here to make this theoretical. Ellen said. Or it may feel like you're bringing the worst room in the world into hers. That stopped me. The trouble was, by then I no longer knew when I was thinking like a grieving husband, when like a teacher, when like a man asking forgiveness, and when like somebody trying to use evidence to cover shame. They overlap badly. In the end, I brought not the metronome, but one of the cards. The bed card. Safe written in Marjorie's hand on the back. The library meeting room was painted the sort of friendly beige public buildings choose when they hope not to intensify anybody's life. Fluorescent lights overhead. A square table. 4 stackable chairs, one interior window looking onto the circulation desk. Rachel Doyle entered exactly on time, wearing a dark green coat and no makeup I could see. 39, perhaps, though trauma edits age unpredictably. Her hair was pulled back, her face had a composure that did not read as calm so much as discipline. There was hearing technology at one ear, discreet but visible. Her left wrist bore the marks of a nervous habit. The skin there was rubbed slightly pale, where fingers might touch it often. She looked at me once fully, and I understood at once that whatever she had imagined about me over the years, it had not been much good. Mr. Mercer. Rachel. I did not offer my hand. She did not offer hers. Daniel had waited outside by design. Ellen had stayed home by necessity. Someone needed to be in the house if Martin called or appeared, and though we had told no one anything directly, the world has a way of sensing when old furniture begins to move. Rachel sat opposite me and put both hands flat on the table as if beginning an interview she intended to keep short. What do you know? She asked. I told her carefully. The wall, the cards, Laura Bell, the note, my letter. I did not say Martin's name until she did. She did not flinch when I said it. That was worse than flinching would have been. So you know enough, she said, to know she wasn't hiding me because I was noisy. Yes. And enough to know she didn't tell you. The sentence was not cruel, it was simply accurate. Yes. She looked away then toward the little wired glass window in the meeting room door. I used to think maybe you knew and didn't help. Then I thought maybe you didn't know at all. For a long time I couldn't decide which made me angrier. I took that without protest because there was nothing honorable in defending myself against a child's old judgment when I had only just earned my own. I'm sorry, I said. Her eyes came back to mine. That's a beginning, not an answer. Yes. That seemed to satisfy her enough to continue. She told the story in pieces. Not because she was evasive, because piece by piece was how it had lived in her. She was 10 that spring. Staying with an aunt, tied to a church outreach family after a bad arrangement elsewhere had gone worse. Martin Vale had been one of the men who checked in, which in the language of adults had sounded kind and in the life of a child had meant something she learned to dread before she could describe why. He spoke gently. He knelt to eye level. He touched shoulders like blessings. He used calm to erase alarm. A deaf child, half reading lips and half reading rooms, learns fast what hearing adults often miss. Danger can smile without changing temperature. I didn't have the words then, she said. Not in a way people believed. I just knew my body hated him before anyone else's did. The room seemed to tighten around that. Marjorie had met her through church meal distribution, then again through some reading program that had children in and out of parish rooms after school. Rachel did not remember the exact sequence. Children in fear remembered door frames and textures more than calendars. But she remembered Marjorie's house. The hallway runner, the smell of laundry, the room upstairs with the brass bed, the way Marjorie never promised impossible things. That's how I knew she was different, Rachel said. She didn't say, "It's all right." She said, "This room is safe for now." For now. Even in protection, my wife had been precise. Rachel touched her left wrist with the fingers of her right hand, once then again. There were times she brought me there before he came, and times she moved me while he was there. The sentence removed the last scaffold of denial I had not known I still possessed. While he was there, I repeated. Rachel nodded. She'd feel the floor, or touch the wall, or move that little ticking thing. The metronome. Yes. For the first time, something like expression crossed her face, though it was not softness. More like recognition entering old scar tissue. I hated it at first. Then I waited for it. Because I knew if I could feel it, she was near enough to still be choosing. I did not understand the full sentence until several seconds after she said it, and by then it had already done its damage. Near enough to still be choosing. That was what the metronome had been. Not music, not time in the abstract. Proof of an adult still actively keeping the line between danger and a child. I took the bed card from my coat pocket and laid it on the table between us. We found this. Rachel stared at it without touching. Then very carefully she turned it over and saw Marjorie's block-printed safe on the back. Her face did not collapse. That would have been easier. Instead, it emptied in one small, precise place around the eyes, as if an old bracing had finally sourly slipped. She wrote those herself, Rachel said. I kept one. My pulse jumped. You did? Rachel nodded. A blue square. It meant the room. I still have it. She looked at the card on the table again and then up at me. There was something else, she said. You should know it because it's yours too. Nothing in me wanted the sentence that followed. He liked that your house was so quiet, she said. He said, quiet houses tell you what people are willing to ignore. I do not know what expression crossed my face then. Rachel looked away from it quickly, which was mercy of a brutal kind. That line was more frightening than any threat could have been, because it named the villain's strategy in his own calm language, not ranting, not crude, observant. He had studied my home and correctly assessed its weakness, decorum, order, the family talent for smoothing surfaces while trouble moved behind them. I asked, though my mouth had gone nearly dry. Did he ever? Rachel lifted one hand. No details, she said. Not for you. Not because I'm being difficult, because that isn't what matters for what comes next. What matters is that Marjorie knew enough, and he knew she knew enough. That's why the hiding had to be repeated. Repeated. The word struck like another door opening in the house. Not one emergency. Not one night. Repeated. How many times, I asked. Rachel's gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder. I don't know. More than once. Fewer than forever. Enough that she taught me the cards. Enough that she changed the room depending on the day. The room, the wardrobe, the towels. Sometimes the chair downstairs. Sometimes whether she'd bring up a tray before or after the doorbell. That was the point of no return revelation in practical form. Not simply that my wife once hid a child. That she built and adjusted a living system around a pattern of danger. The hiding was not accidental or singular. It was operational. My own house had contained an active defense network, and I had mistaken it for housekeeping. I sat very still because any movement felt vulgar. Rachel looked at me with a tired steadiness that belonged to no child anymore. You want the worst part? I did not answer. She trusted you enough to keep trying, Rachel said, but not enough to stop planning around you. There are sentences that divide a life into before and after more cleanly than death notices do. That was one of them. I think I nodded. I am not sure. Rachel reached into her coat pocket and brought out a laminated square worn white at the edges. A simple blue block printed in the middle. The room, she said. I looked at it and knew with a kind of terrible gratitude that paper alone had just shifted the balance of the whole story. We had moved from inference to witness to object carried forward through years. What do you want from me? I asked. She held the card between two fingers, looking at it rather than at me. Nothing that helps you feel better, she said. Then she raised her eyes. But if you're going to tell the truth, Tell it where he can hear you. In a room he trusted. I thought of the parlor at once, of the angled chair, the tea tray, Marjorie crossing the room with her careful hands. Rachel put the blue card back in her pocket. Then, after a silence that felt shaped rather than empty, she said the line that carried all of part 3 into the next movement and made return impossible. Your wife said the room would listen. Your wife said the room would listen. Rachel's words stayed with me all the way home. I drove back through the late afternoon in a kind of clear exhaustion that felt almost medicinal after the previous days of shock and inference. The November light over Columbus had that flat pewter look it gets before dark, when everything church steeples, gas stations, bare sycamores, low office roofs seems temporarily made of the same tired metal. Traffic moved around me with the oblivious steadiness of people still inside their ordinary Thursdays. I stopped at a red light on Broad and looked at my own hands on the steering wheel. The knuckles swollen slightly with age, the wedding band loose in winter, the way it always got when my fingers went cold. Your wife said the room would listen. I had spent 11 months trying to preserve Marjorie's memory by keeping her house as she left it. I had dusted around her objects, folded her linens the way she liked them, carried groceries through the kitchen with the absurd care of a man who thinks devotion means not disturbing the dead. All the while, I had been worshipping the shape of her life instead of the courage inside it. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I knew 2 things with a clarity I had not had in days. The first was that Martin Vale had to hear the truth inside my house. The second was that if I invited him in, I would only get one chance to do it right. The porch light had clicked on before I reached the front steps. Ellen had done that when she was anxious ever since she was 15. Daniel's car was behind mine. Through the front windows I could see the warm pools of lamplight in the parlor and dining room, and for the first time in nearly a week the sight did not comfort me. It looked staged. It looked like a set waiting for the scene that would finally make sense of it. Daniel met me in the hall. Well, I took off my coat slowly and hung it on the rack Marjorie had insisted belonged inside the hall closet, but tolerated by the door because she said a family is not a museum. I did not answer him until I had straightened the collar on the hanger. Old habits die slowly, even under revelation. She confirmed it, I said. Ellen, standing just beyond the archway to the dining room, went still. How much, Daniel asked. Enough. I looked from one to the other. More than enough. I told them then. Rachel's words, not every one of them, because some truths are not mine to repeat in full, but what mattered. Repeated hiding. The room is system, not accident. Martin's calm assessment of quiet houses, the blue square card, Marjorie's sentence about the room listening. I told them what Rachel had said about Marjorie trusting me enough to keep trying, but not enough to stop planning around me. That last line changed Ellen's face in the old wounded way a person looks when family truth arrives, not as surprise, but as naming. Daniel took no notes while I spoke. That alone told me he understood the gravity had shifted. We were past accumulation. We were at arrangement. When I finished, he let the silence hold for a moment. Then he said, "All right." Ellen looked at him. "All right." He nodded once. "Now we move." She turned to me. "What are you thinking?" I looked toward the parlor. The room was visible from where we stood only in fragments, the arm of the sofa, the edge of the brass lamp, one slice of the rug. Enough to know it was there. Enough to know Martin had occupied it in peace too often. I'm thinking I said that he trusted this house almost as much as I did. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "You want him here?" "Yes." Ellen crossed her arms. "Dad, I know what you're going to say." "Do you?" "Yes. That he'll lie, that he'll stay calm, that he'll try to turn me into a grieving old man who's confused by old church paperwork and memory, that if I do this wrong, I hand him back the room." That silenced her for a beat. Daniel said, "Those are all true." "Yes," I said, "which is why we do it right." The plan took shape at the dining room table where we had already spent so many hours turning domestic life into sequence. It would not be a trap in the vulgar sense. No hidden camera, no theatrical surprise. Daniel would not pretend to be absent. Rachel would not walk in without consent. There would be no ambush that let Martin claim trickery. It had to be cleaner than that. The truth had to arrive not like a stunt, but like a house finally speaking in full. We chose Sunday afternoon because Martin still visited parishioners on Sundays, still answered calls from old families, still kept that particular part of his identity polished. I would call him the next morning and say I wanted to speak about a memorial contribution in Marjorie's name, something private, something that should be done in the house. That would bring him. Pride and appetite often look like service on respectable men. Daniel would be present, openly seated at the dining room table when Martin arrived, because Daniel's authority mattered more if it was not concealed. Ellen would be there too. Rachel, after discussion and refusal, and another discussion, agreed to come only after the first phase once the evidence was laid, and Martin had already committed himself to an account. Laura Bell, when Daniel called her, said she would come if Rachel wanted her there. Rachel said yes. What if he doesn't show? Ellen asked. He'll show, I said. Why are you so sure? Because men like Martin Vale do not surrender rooms. They believe they understand, I thought. Because they cannot imagine old furniture turning against them, because he had spent years trusting the architecture of comfort more than the courage of the people inside it. But what I said was, because he still thinks I'm the man I was last week. No one argued with that. The next morning I called him from the kitchen. He answered on the third ring with the same low ease I had once found reassuring. Tom. Just that. My first name warmed slightly. No surprise, no caution. He had always been a man who believed tone could establish innocence in advance. Martin, how are you holding up the old script? The old soft entry. For a second so brief it was almost shameful, my body remembered the habit of being guided by it. Then I looked through the kitchen doorway toward the hall where the removed nursery closet contents were stacked in labeled order against the wall, and the habit died again. I've been going through some of Marjorie's things, I said. There's a matter of a memorial contribution I'd like to discuss. Privately. A pause. Just long enough to sound thoughtful, not hesitant. Of course. I'd rather do it here. That's fine. Sunday at 2. That should be all right. His voice never altered. No edge, no wariness. If he had any private alarm, it was already disciplined into silence. That frightened me more than open concern would have. Before we hung up, he said, She was a remarkable woman, Tom. There are moments when a man discovers that self-control is not the same as the absence of violence. I held the phone so hard my fingers hurt. Yes, I said. She was. I set the receiver down very carefully. Sunday arrived cold and bright, the kind of Ohio afternoon where light seems to sharpen the edges of dormant trees and make every window in a neighborhood look slightly overexposed. I spent the morning in work clothes, not church clothes, because this was not a performance of reverence. It was labor. I moved through the house with deliberate hands. The broken bedroom wall had been professionally opened further by then. Evan had returned Friday and Saturday to make the space visible without damaging what remained. The cavity stood exposed on both sides now, not grotesquely, not like a ruin, but plainly. The hidden ledge, the padded studs, the false back, the hooks, the vent holes, the tactile code board we had finally uncovered behind one narrow panel marked not in words but in raised notches. 1 pause, 2 pause, 3, and a longer groove at the edge. Safe movement. Stillness. Marjorie approaching. Rachel had helped interpret what could be said for sure and refused to force what could not. I left the bedroom door open. I moved the metronome from the hall console to the parlor table. Not as a trick, as a witness. The laminated cards lay stacked beside it, bed cup, hand door, blue square. Laura Bell's note was in a sleeve. The church volunteer schedules were clipped together. The intake record Daniel had obtained sat beneath them. Rachel's blue square card remained in her own keeping where it belonged, but she had agreed to bring it when she came. The parlor chair Martin used to favor had been turned square with the others. I considered leaving it as he preferred, then decided no. He would not sit in the old angle today. The room would not accommodate him that way again. At 1:30, Rachel arrived with Laura Bell. Rachel wore the same dark green coat and a navy scarf. She looked as if she had slept little and chosen not to apologize for it. Laura carried no satchel this time, only a folder under one arm. Ellen met them at the door and took them not to the parlor but to the dining room where they would wait until I asked. When Rachel crossed the hall, she looked up toward the stairs, not theatrically, not as a person expecting ghosts, but as someone taking the measure of a structure she had once known under different physics. Her mouth tightened once and then settled. "Thank you for coming," I said. She met my eyes. "I'm not here for him." "I know." That seemed to be enough. At 2:05, Daniel took his place at the dining room table with the calm stillness of a man who knows that the worst proceedings are often the quietest. Ellen stood by the sideboard, arms folded, jaw set. Laura sat near the far end of the table. Rachel remained with them out of sight from the parlor. We had discussed whether I should greet Martin alone. In the end, I decided yes, not because I needed drama, because the first look between us belonged to me. At 2 exactly, the bell rang. I opened the door before the second chime. Martin Vale stood on the porch in a charcoal overcoat and burgundy scarf, leather gloves. In one hand, his expression arranged into concern so practiced it barely seemed chosen anymore. Age had been kind to him in the way it often is to men who have made serenity part of their public face. Silver at the temples, clean lines, a mouth that suggested patience until you knew how to watch what patience was doing. "Tom," he said softly. "Good to see you." It was not good to see him. I stepped aside. "Come in." He entered, as he always had, not tentative, not presumptuous, with that exact degree of familiarity that lets a man seem gracious rather than invasive. He removed his coat, handed it to me without asking, and glanced once toward the parlor. Then he saw the metronome on the table. It was the smallest change. A pause under the eyes, not even a full blink. But I saw it. "Ah," he said. "That old thing." "Yes." He smiled faintly. Marjorie kept everything with a pulse. The sentence was almost elegant. Once I would have admired it. Now I heard how easily he handled objects that had belonged to fear. I gestured toward the sofa rather than the chair he used to take. "Sit." He sat. I did not. For a few seconds we were simply two older men in a familiar front room on a Sunday afternoon. The lamplight was warm. The windows held winter brightness. Somewhere deeper in the house, the furnace moved air through the vents with a soft, low rush. There was nothing spectacular about the scene. That was what made it so exact. The room had once protected him with ordinary civility. Today it would not. "You said there was a memorial matter," he said. "There is." I looked at him long enough that his practiced calm had to do a little work. Then I said, "Before we get to that, I want to show you something." His gaze moved to the metronome, then to the small stack of cards beside it. He did not touch them. "What have you been repairing upstairs?" he asked lightly. "I noticed the contractor's truck on Friday when I was passing." So he had passed. That knowledge slid coldly into me. "A wall," I said, "beside the old nursery closet." He gave one sympathetic nod. "Old houses never fail one thing at a time." "No," I said. "They don't." I picked up the bed card and handed it to him. He took it, politely, looked at the drawing, turned it over, saw Marjorie's block-printed safe, and returned it to me without visible strain. "I'm not sure I understand," he said. "Then let me help." I lifted the metronome and set it down again so its felted feet touched the wood with a soft, muted contact. Then I let the pendulum swing. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Martin looked at it once, then at me. I found a child-sized shelter space inside my bedroom wall, I said. Accessible through the nursery closet. My wife built it. Nothing in his face yet. Not even confusion, only attentiveness. In that wall, I continued, we found these cards. A ledge, cups, padding, a tactile code board, vent holes hidden behind furniture. We found evidence that Marjorie structured the upstairs around keeping a hearing-impaired child quiet, calm, and able to understand whether movement was safe. The smallest movement then, Martin's hand settling more firmly on one knee. That is an extraordinary thing to say. It is an extraordinary thing to find. And what has that to do with me? There it was. The old method. Not denial first. Narrowing first. Ask for relevance in a tone of saddened reason. Make the other person leap farther than his proof. Let dignity do triage on the truth. I did not answer him. Instead, I called Daniel. My son-in-law stepped into the parlor from the dining room and remained standing near the arch. Martin's eyes went to him, then sharpened half a degree. "Daniel," he said. "I didn't realize, no," Daniel said evenly. "I imagine there are a number of things you didn't realize." Martin did not look at him long. He returned his attention to me because I was still in his understanding the room's weakest point, and thus the point that mattered. "Tom," he said with measured concern. "Now, if this is some kind of confusion born out of grief." No. I had not raised my voice. I did not need to. The word landed hard enough by itself. I picked up Laura Bell's note and handed that to him next. He read it, or rather his eyes moved over it. When he got to certain visitor, his jaw tightened so slightly I could see it only because I was watching for anything human in him now. He handed it back. "I don't know who Laura Bell is." "That's unfortunate," I said, "because she knows exactly what those tools upstairs were for." He let out a small breath through his nose. Almost a laugh, almost pity. "Tom, you have a retired specialist making speculative interpretations about old objects in a damaged wall. You have a grieving family with half-memories and a need for meaning. That is not evidence of wrongdoing by anyone, much less me." The old room shivered under the sentence. There it was, the correction. The calm reduction of pain into muddle. The framing of the injured as eager, emotional, undisciplined. I had heard him do gentler versions of that to parishioners for years. I had mistaken it for pastoral steadiness. Today, with the metronome ticking between us, it became something else entirely. "Laura," I said. Laura Bell came in then and stood beside Daniel. Martin's face changed more visibly at the sight of her than it had at the note. "Mrs. Bell," he said. "This is inappropriate." "I'm long past worrying about your definition of appropriate," she said. That was the first crack in the mask that anyone not already looking could have seen, and he turned back to me at once. "Tom, listen to yourself. This is exactly how old rumors get dressed as moral certainty. You are better than this. Once that line would have reached me. Better than this, better than conflict, better than suspicion, better than forcing ugliness into public air without immaculate proof. It was the language of my old obedience, my old comfort in being the reasonable man in the room. "My wife built a child's refuge inside our bedroom wall," I said. "That happened, in fact, not in rumor. And you've built an accusation around it." "No." I leaned forward, both hands on the back of the chair opposite him. "She did." He went very still. I saw then with a clarity that made me almost calm that the most frightening thing about Martin Vale was not predatory force, not hidden rage, not even appetite. It was how deeply he believed in his own authorship of rooms. He believed he could still tell me what kind of scene I was in. He said softly now, "Be careful." I smiled for the first time in his presence in days, and there was no warmth in it. "I was careful," I said. "That's why you're still here." Then I called Rachel. No speech, no dramatic entrance. She simply walked into the parlor and stopped near the dining room arch, coat still on one hand, at her wrist, the way she held herself when choosing steadiness. Martin looked at her, and in that look, his entire moral costume failed by one irreparable seam. Not outrage, not confusion, recognition first, calculation second. That was enough. Rachel did not sit. She looked at him the way adults look at the objects of old terror once they have finally shrunk to human size. Martin's voice, when it came, was even quieter. "I wondered if this was about you." Rachel said, "I know." That exchange alone sickened me. He turned to me at once. "Tom, whatever she believes she remembers." "She remembers enough," Rachel said. He did not look at her. That was his mistake. Or perhaps it had always been his habit. Speak around the vulnerable person. Reframe over her head. Manage the room, not the wound. Rachel took one step forward. "Look at me," she said. For a second, I thought he would refuse. Then he did look. In that moment, the whole shape of power in the house altered. Not because she frightened him by force. Because she denied him the old architecture in which he could remain the interpreter and she the interpreted. Rachel Doyle, once hidden in my walls, now stood in my parlor and required him to occupy the plain fact of her. He said, "I'm sorry you're distressed." Rachel almost laughed. It was the saddest sound in the room. "You still talk like the room belongs to you." That line landed like a hand across the face. Martin rose, then slowly, with the caution of a man deciding which version of dignity remained available. "I won't be tried in a private home by grief and suggestion." "No," Daniel said from the archway. "You'll just be witnessed in one." He took a step toward the front hall, coat still hanging near the door. I moved before I had fully chosen to, and stood between him and the arch. I did not touch him. I simply occupied the line of exit with my full height, my age, my grief, and everything I had failed to be until now. That was my moral force moment, though I did not know to name it then. It was not loud. It was not violent. It was a man who had spent a week learning the cost of his own passivity and had finally stepped into the only kind of strength that still belonged to him. "You will sit down," I said, "and hear what my wife built, because you will not leave this house protected by the same silence you used to move through it." For the first time, his composure slipped visibly. "Move," he said. "No." His eyes hardened. There at last, under all the silk and patience and pastoral training, was the private contempt. Not theatrical, not explosive. Worse. The contempt of a man offended that an old mark had changed shape. "You don't know what you're doing." I held his gaze. That is exactly what Marjorie feared. The name struck him harder than anything else had. Behind me I heard the metronome still ticking on the table. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Like an old heart refusing interruption. Martin looked from me to Rachel to Laura Bell to Daniel. He understood then, I think, that the room was no longer his. Not because we had trapped him cleverly. Because the one protection he depended on, our reluctance to stain the room with truth, had ended. He sat. What followed was not confession. Real men like Martin Vale do not often grant the theater of confession unless they believe it still serves control. What we got instead was something structurally stronger and morally uglier collapse by failed reframing. Daniel laid out the record cleanly. Marjorie's note to Laura Bell referencing a certain visitor. The visual supports, the house modifications, the church outreach and counseling schedules, the temporary placement record for Rachel, the photographs showing Martin's repeated positioning for line of sight into the hall, Ellen's childhood memory of her mother sending her downstairs and tapping the wall, the tactile code board in the cavity, Rachel's blue square card, Rachel's direct witness that Marjorie hid her during Martin's visits and used the system repeatedly. At each stage, Martin tried a new shelter. Misremembered context, pastoral misunderstanding, overzealous kindness by Marjorie, the confusion of a child in crisis, the distortion of time, the danger of projecting adult meaning backward into a frightened girl's memory. He used every careful phrase available to a man who had spent years laundering moral threat through language. Each one failed a little faster than the last. Laura Bell's authority stripped his interpretation of the objects. Rachel's restraint stripped his condescension of moral weight. Daniel's procedural precision stripped his vagueness of safe room. My own presence, my refusal to soften, to apologize, to call any of this tragic misunderstanding, stripped him of the final comfort he had expected from me. The mask fully collapsed, not in one dramatic burst, but in sequence. First, his patience curdled into irritation. Then, irritation narrowed into offense. Then offense showed the naked assumption beneath it that all of us at bottom should have preferred the old arrangement to the trouble of truth. He looked at me at one point and said, "No longer soft. Do you understand what this will do to your family?" I said, yes. You will destroy the memory of your wife in public rumor. No, I said. You did your best to bury it in private fear. He flinched then. Only once. Enough. Rachel spoke next, and the room changed again. She did not narrate the whole past. She did not need to. She stood in my parlor and used only the details that mattered for moral finality. The blue square card, the repeated hiding the metronome, Marjorie's refusal to promise. Lies Martin's sentence about quiet houses telling you what people ignore. She described without spectacle the bodily certainty of danger in a child who could not yet make adults hear what her fear already knew. She said Marjorie never asked her to protect the reputation of the church or the counselor or the house. She only asked her to remember that certain rooms could still tell the truth later. Martin tried to interrupt once. Rachel lifted one hand and said no. You had the room long enough. He fell silent. Daniel stepped out, then, not dramatically, simply to make the call that had been waiting beside the truth. The county prosecutor's office already knew enough from him to understand the need for formal intake, not because everything could be proven in one afternoon, but because enough could no longer be buried under reverence. 2 investigators were on their way. Laura Bell stayed. Rachel stayed. Ellen remained by the sideboard with both hands braced against its edge, as if she let go she might either shake or strike someone, and had no wish to do either. Martin looked toward the front window once, toward the street, the neighborhood, the visible world of maintained lawns and winter light and the 1,000 ordinary lives that had no idea what was ending in my parlor. When he looked back at me, the smoothness was gone for good. "You are making a mistake," he said. I had waited my whole life to hear that line from the right side of a room. "No," I said. "I made one years ago." Then I told him the truth that had been waiting in me since the nursery floor. I thought being decent meant trusting men who spoke gently in my house. I thought dignity meant not naming ugliness until it arrived with paperwork and witnesses and permission. My wife knew better. She built a second language into my home because I failed the first one. I won't fail it again. There was no speech after that. Nothing worth preserving. Martin stopped trying to recover the room because the room had already gone. What remained was procedure, waiting the slow, hard fact of a man sitting in a chair he once used as cover and understanding that every soft thing in the house now belonged to someone else's memory of courage. When the investigators arrived, the story passed out of my private possession in the necessary ways. Names, statements, objects catalogued, photographs taken, questions put in plain sequence. Daniel handled the legal edges. Laura gave her notes. Rachel gave what she was willing to give, and no more. I opened the upstairs in full. The metronome, the cards, the tactile board, the marked towels, the photographs, the schedules, the altered wardrobe position, the vent holes, the hidden ledge, all of it moved from rumor to record. Justice in real life is not as clean as revenge fantasies promise. No one clapped, no one confessed in tears, no judge descended. There was paperwork. There were carefully worded next steps. There was Martin leaving the house under scrutiny rather than deference, with no room left to stand in except the plain one. There would be investigations after that, institutional questions, perhaps other witnesses, perhaps not enough of some things and more than enough of others. Truth does not become perfect simply because it is finally spoken. But something essential had happened in my parlor that no later proceeding could undo. False sanctity had died there. After they were all gone, investigators, Laura Daniel to the porch with them, Ellen to the kitchen where she finally let herself cry where no one but me could hear it. Rachel standing in the hall a moment longer before asking if she might see the room once more. I found myself alone in the parlor with the metronome. I stopped its pendulum with one finger. The silence afterward was not empty. It was earned. Rachel came back into the room carrying her coat over one arm. "I'm going upstairs," she said. "I'll come with you." She considered, then nodded. We climbed together without speaking. The house did not feel hostile anymore. Not healed. Healed is too neat a word, but no longer deceptive in the same way. The worst thing about deception is not merely hidden truth. It is enforced misreading. That had ended. The house had not changed materially in the past hour. The plaster was still broken. The nursery was still scarred by discovery. The linen passage still held shelves of cotton and lavender and the Blue Cross towels. But the rooms no longer had to collaborate with silence. Rachel stood a long while at the threshold of the nursery. The brass bed was remade now. Ellen had straightened it that morning because she cannot endure displaced quilts any more than her mother could. The wardrobe still stood slightly away from its old scrape line. The closet wall was open. The cavity beyond showed itself plainly. Afternoon was already thinning into evening, and the nursery window carried that pale, late light that makes old paint look almost luminous for a few minutes before dark. Rachel took 3 slow steps in and stopped beside the wall opening. "She made it bigger," she said. I looked at her. "What?" "The first time." Rachel touched the edge of one stud with 2 fingers. It was smaller. I remember because my shoulder hurt against that corner. Later, there was more padding, and this ledge was higher. Even now, even after the confrontation, the exposure, the authorities, the moral victory of finally naming the truth, I was still learning my wife in pieces that cost me. "She changed it as she learned what you needed," I said. Rachel nodded. We stood together in the room for a long minute. Then she said, "I used to think she was only protecting me from him, but she was also protecting the room from becoming his. Does that make sense?" "Yes," I said. And it did. Over the next several weeks, the story moved outward and inward at once. Outward, there were interviews, church board meetings from which Martin was absent, statements, records, requests, old conversations reheard under new pressure. One more woman from the parish who called Daniel quietly to say there had once been a child who refused to go into the counseling room if Martin was there. Not enough on its own. Enough to widen the shape. Men like Martin do not fall because one perfect piece of evidence arrives wrapped in justice. They fall because enough small, true things stop behaving as if they are unrelated. Inward, there was the house. I had expected naively that after the confrontation, I might not bear it. Instead, I found that I could finally move through it without performing ignorance. That is not peace, but it is a condition necessary to peace. I kept the wall open longer than the contractors recommended. Evan, to his credit, never once treated the matter like neighborhood drama. He came when called, measured what would need to be repaired, and asked only practical questions. At the end of one afternoon, as he was coiling extension cord in the hall, he said, "Mr. Mercer, you want it made like it was." I looked through the plasticless opening into the cavity at the ledge and the code board and the places where Marjorie's hands had solved problems I did not know existed. "No," I said. "I want it made honest." He nodded as though that were a carpentry instruction he understood perfectly. We did not rebuild it into secrecy. Instead, we preserved part of the cavity behind a shallow framed opening on the nursery side, protected but visible with the ledge and one section of the tactile board intact. Not as a shrine, as truth. The bedroom side was repaired cleanly. I could not have slept forever beside the exposed wound, nor should I have had to. But the house would not be asked to lie again on both sides of the wall. I moved the parlor chair Martin had used to the study and left it there, facing the books where it belonged, no special line of sight. I did not burn it. I am too old for symbolic bonfires and too respectful of walnut frames, but it would not sit in that room again. The metronome I cleaned myself. Not polished into newness, only cleaned. Dust from the felted feet, old grime from the brass arm. One tiny scratch on the wood I had never noticed before because I had never looked at it as an instrument of survival. When I wound it after that, the sound no longer tightened my chest in the same way. It remained painful, but pain had changed species. It was no longer dread. It was respect. Rachel came to the house 3 times after the confrontation. The first was to walk through the upstairs without witnesses. The second was to bring Laura and speak with an investigator in the dining room where Marjorie had once sorted church envelopes and grocery coupons. The third was in late March, when the air had softened and the side yard held the first ragged daffodils Marjorie always planted too close together. That third visit is the one I keep. Ellen came with her daughter Lucy, who was 8 and full of the serious curiosity certain children have when they sense adults are treating a place with special care. The guest room, once the nursery, then the half-forgotten small bedroom, then the room of truth, had been remade with fresh white sheets and the blue coverlet washed and set straight. The framed alphabet print still hung there because Rachel, when asked, said to leave it. The preserved opening on the closet side was covered with museum glass Daniel insisted on, and I at first disliked, until I understood it meant the house could tell the truth without being forced to reopen the wound bodily every day. The late afternoon light came through the window at an angle Marjorie would have called forgiving. Rachel stood by the bed. Lucy hovered near Ellen's knee, trying and failing not to stare. Laura Bell sat in the chair by the window. Daniel was downstairs on a work call. The house smelled of clean cotton lemon oil and the roast chicken Ellen had put in the oven because some habits of care should not be surrendered merely because history has become heavy. I brought in the metronome. Lucy said, "What's that?" "A very old timer," Ellen said. Rachel looked at me. I looked at her. Then I set it on the windowsill where the light caught the worn walnut and the brass arm. "May I?" she asked. I nodded. She wound it gently and set the pendulum moving. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Lucy listened with the frank fascination of childhood. "It sounds like walking." Rachel smiled, then the first unguarded smile I had seen fully reach her face. "It used to mean different things," she said. Like what Rachel looked at the wall, then back at Lucy. Like stay still, or wait, or somebody safe is close. Lucy considered that gravely, as children do when they sense an answer belongs to several worlds at once. "Can I feel it?" she asked. Rachel crouched beside the bed and rested her fingers on the wood frame. "Here." Lucy put her hand down beside Rachel's and went very still. "There," Rachel said softly. "Do you feel the little pulse?" Lucy's eyes widened. "Yes." I stood in the doorway and watched them, the grown woman once hidden in my walls, guiding my granddaughter's fingers to the rhythm that had once meant survival, now offered in open light as history, memory, and trust. That was the healing image. Not because everything was mended, not because the investigators had solved every question or the church had suddenly transformed into a machine of moral clarity. Not because my marriage returned to innocence. It never would. Some things cannot be restored, even when truth wins. I cannot unknow that Marjorie built her bravest work around my blindness. I cannot reclaim the version of myself who would have sworn honestly and wrongly that nothing in this house required a secret language. What can be reclaimed is different. The house, not as shrine, not as crime scene, as an honest place. The family meaning of it. Not that we were always safe here. That when safety failed, one woman refused to let fear have the last architectural word. My wife's memory. Not as the neat hostess who kept polished rooms and folded towels with exact corners, though she was those things too. As the morally braver spouse who used every domestic skill at her disposal, Linen furniture, timing cards, rhythm, false cheer, narrowed sightlines, practical hands to protect a child when comfort-loving adults. Myself, chief among them, had not yet understood what kind of war had entered by the front door. Lucy laughed softly when the tickling pulse under the bed frame surprised her again. Rachel laughed too, and Laura Bell looked away toward the window with the particular stillness older women wear when they are trying to give other people privacy around tears. Ellen came to stand beside me in the doorway. She'd have liked this light, she said. Yes. For a while, we all let the room stay as it was. No speeches. No grand moral summary. Only the metronome keeping time in open air, the glass over the preserved wall catching the last of the sun. The smell of dinner coming up faintly from below, and a child learning with her fingertips what another child once learned there under very different terms. At last, Rachel rose. She went to the preserved opening and touched the glass once over the ledge. Then she turned to me. She knew you'd get here late, she said, but she thought you'd get here. That was generous. More generous than I had earned from her. I almost tried to refuse it on principle. Then I understood that refusing grace can become another form of vanity. I wish I'd been faster, I said. So do I, she answered. And because she was a better guardian of truth than many respectable people I have known, she added, but here. That is the best version of peace I know now. Not forgiveness as erasure, not victory as neatness, only the earned right to stand in a changed house and say, here is here. When they all left that evening and the chicken bones were wrapped and the dishes stacked and the downstairs lamps turned low, I went back up once more to the guest room alone. The metronome was still on the sill. Outside the yard had gone blue with dusk. The maple branches made shadows across the grass. From somewhere far off came the train whistle you can hear on certain evenings if the air is right. Inside the room, the clean cotton smell lingered over the bed, and the wall no longer hidden, not exposed in violence, simply held in truth, kept its silence without deceit. I wound the metronome once more and let it run. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and placed my fingers lightly on the wooden frame the way Rachel had shown Lucy. There it was, the small, steady pulse through the wood. Time, warning, steadiness, presence. For years I had thought my wife's greatest gift to this house was order. I was wrong. It was moral design. She made a room listen when the people in it could not yet do so well enough. I sat there until the ticking slowed and the spring wound down into quiet. The last light left the window. The room held. And for the first time since Marjorie died, the house did not feel like something I was merely preserving. It felt like something I had finally begun, however late to deserve.